Broken Dreams. A Paranormal Protector Tale. Book 3 in the Heart of Stone series. Written by Demelza, Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. I declare you guilty of the murder of Lady Pamela Burke, and sentence you to be hanged by the neck, until dead. For any normal man, or any murderer, those words should have signaled the end of his story. But for Ben and his brothers, who were not guilty of Pamela's murder, no matter what the magistrate said, it was but the beginning of a new chapter, a twist in the tale as it were, because in Ben's experience, fate always had other plans. As did the prison superintendent. I do not like that shirt. The collar points are too high, and my cravat is tied all wrong for the current fashion. I insist you change it more like so. The superintendent lifted his chin so that Ben might better see how his cravat was tied today. Ben nodded gravely. Yes, sir. But I will need a new canvas and more paint, to properly capture your likeness anew. As always, I am at your service, sir. He bowed deeply, almost like a gentleman or perhaps a gentleman's valet, though he was neither. Then you shall have it. I must have a portrait that portrays me perfectly. The superintendent rang the bell with violence more in keeping with his reputation, as the hard man in charge of a prison filled with the worst offenders in Scotland. Alan, he bellowed. Alan, the superintendent's manservant, appeared after a short moment. Yes, sir? He pointedly ignored Ben as usual. Prisoners were beneath his notice. I want you to order more canvas and paints for stone here. Immediately, the superintendent said. Yes, sir. His bow wasn't as low as Ben's had been, which made the superintendent frown. Forgive me, sir, but a messenger arrived with an urgent letter. Alan held out the missive, his thumb carefully placed over the wax seal so as to hide it from Ben's view. Ben hid a smile. He didn't care a whit for the superintendent's correspondence, but he'd hear about it soon enough, for the man liked to talk while Ben painted. Usually about the latest fashions in London, for the man was definitely a dandy of the most passionate kind, but on rare occasions he talked of other things. Sure enough, the superintendent snatched the letter from his servant's hand and dismissed him. Ben added a few brush strokes to his painting while he waited, knowing that the superintendent would change his mind on the morrow, and wished to keep this one as well as anything else he commanded Ben to create. Finally, the superintendent made a derisive sound and threw the letter down on the table. Do you know what foolishness the high and mighty in London are up to this time? Some strange new fashion, most likely. Ben allowed his eyes to widen in surprise. Me? No, sir. They seem to think that there are good men in prison, hard workers, and not just criminals. They want me to find any man trained in the building trades, stonemasonry, brickwork, carpentry and the like, so they might transport them to the Swan River colony to build things. This was definitely an improvement over the latest way to tie a cravat. Hope gave a feeble flap within Ben's breast. Indeed, sir. The superintendent laughed. They have even offered a reward for every felon transported. He grew thoughtful. Do you know of any prisoners who might satisfy my superiors? Even one man? Ben pretended to think hard, then said slowly, I can only think of 3 men, sir. My brothers Torsten and Dunstan are a master stonemason and a ship's carpenter, respectively, and then there's me. I was training as an apprentice stonemason with my brother Torsten, until I was arrested. I would have finished my apprenticeship by now and be a full mason. But I cannot think of any other man who might satisfy you, sir. The superintendent's brow furrowed. But you 3 are sentenced to hang, and I want my new portrait painted. Then again, there is the reward, and saving the cost of the hangman. Ben remained silent. He knew the man's vanity and greed warred for supremacy, but he also knew greed always won, for the more coin the superintendent had, the more he could pay his tailor. I suppose it's a fate worse than death, being sent to the Swan River colony. I've heard stories of men starving, killed by natives or wild animals. The soils are so stained in blood, they are permanently red. Nary a woman to be seen, for it is not safe for them, either. With the reward, I might hire a proper painter too. Ben tried to look worried while his heart soared. Fate was smiling on him in her twisted way. If he had to choose between working blood-stained foreign soil or rotting in this prison, he wouldn't hesitate. Oh sir, that sounds terrible. Perhaps if you were to forget I spoke. I'd much rather stay here than be sent to the colonies. It sounds positively frightful. Ah, there it was. The superintendent's sadistic smile, when he thought he was being particularly cruel. Then you shall go to the colonies, Stone. You and your brothers. Perhaps you can pay for your crimes there with your lives instead of being a plague upon good men here. And I shall be able to pay a real painter to paint my portrait. The superintendent summoned a guard to take Ben back to his cell. Ben dragged his feet, hanging his head, but secretly his heart was lighter than air, for his dearest wish was about to be granted. 2. When Ben was only a wee lad, his father would take him and his brothers down to the Firth of Clyde, and he'd point out to sea, where the Kintyre Peninsula ended, and he'd say that fate awaited them out there. Ben and his brothers would peer out at the Irish Sea, straining their eyes to see through the mists, tasting the salt from the waves rocking the boat beneath them, and he swore he could almost taste the future his father promised. Mother's brother, Uncle Stanley, who had gone to the Swan River colony before Ben was born, had sent a letter from those faraway southern shores, and father would quote from it. How Fremantle was like the cliffs of Dover, white sand and stone, topped with green enough to feed as many sheep and cattle as they could imagine, and on the shore as much seaweed as a man could want to fertilize his fields, just piled up on the beach, waiting for them. All his life, Ben had wanted to believe father's tales of this land where fortune waited for them, if they were only bold enough to follow her. Even now in the pre-dawn light, waiting for the sun to rise over the town of Fremantle so that they'd finally be allowed to go ashore, he dared to hope, even as he told himself it was all a fairy story, the sort of fanciful tale told to children to give them exactly this kind of false hope. Yet when the sun rose over those white buildings blessing them with her rosy glow, Ben could have sworn he was still dreaming. The taste of salt stung his cracked lips as he beheld the limestone cliffs, sheering off to his left, while the waves played between the ship and the shore, licking one and then the other, not sure which one it liked the taste of best. If he listened hard, he could even hear the waves whispering to the sand as they caressed it like an army of lovers, one after the other. The waves might touch the ship as if forced by duty, but what they really loved was the land. Just like Uncle Stanley apparently, also father had said. Just as Ben meant to if this land would only let him. It seemed like scarcely a moment before the sun was high in the sky, and he and his brothers were rowing ashore, shoulder to shoulder with the other convicts. For all the stories of being clapped in irons and chain gangs that he'd heard along the way, it was almost like being a free man again, headed home instead of into the unknown. Until one of the waves splashed over the side of the boat, and the water was warm. Back home the sea would be near freezing, but here it was like a bath. Stanley had been right then. The Swan River colony truly was paradise. But convicts were not meant to enjoy the view, they were here to work, the guards reminded them as they ordered them to unload the boats and carry the cargo into the 3-story warehouse on the edge of the beach. Inside the warehouse the floor was damp beach sand, littered with seaweed, but the guards wanted the convicts to carry the cargo inside and lay them on top of the other soaked sacks and chests. For while the warehouse walls might be finished outside, there was nothing inside, no floors or walls or stairs. Torr and Dunstan did not approve, muttering under their breath about the foolishness of bringing anything in here, only to have it ruined, when it was clear from the timber and ballast stacked outside, ready to be loaded aboard ships, that things would be safer outside, beneath the cloudless skies. Ben listened to them for long enough to know what they thought they should do, before he caught the eye of one of the guards he'd helped in the shipboard school. "Sir, do you know why this warehouse is not finished?" Ben asked as he passed, careful not to break stride as he lifted a sack onto each shoulder and carried them off the beach. "Not enough labor, lad." "That's what you're here for," the guard said. Ben nodded thoughtfully. "So that's why my brothers were talking about using that timber to build stairs and upper levels, and those ballast flagstones to raise the floor above the sand." He pulled a pencil and notepad from his pocket, and began to sketch what Dunstan had described. "Something like this, sir?" With a few lines, he was done, and he tore off the page to hand it to the guard. Ben had dallied too long, one of the colony guards had noticed, and was headed over to chastise him for slowing in his work. The other guard quickly hushed him and showed him the sketch, as Ben hurried to lift another sack. By nightfall, they'd begun winching sacks from the sand up to the boards on Dunstan's newly constructed landing. By the end of the week, the landing was a complete first floor with a second underway, and Tor had started laying Yorkshire flagstones on the sand below. He'd even heard Mr. Henderson suggesting to Mr. Ray, his first officer, that they might even be able to extend the commissariat according to the original plans, if the productivity continued at this pace. For that was the fancy name of the warehouse, which towered over most of the other buildings in Fremantle, with the exception of the round house at the top of the cliffs at Arthur Head. So when Ben lay down beside his brothers, all in their hammocks strung up in a row in the much less salubrious warehouse known as Scott Buildings, a short distance along the beach, he had the satisfaction of knowing that they might be convicts, but they were helping to construct the Swan River colony, and on their way to earning a ticket of leave or perhaps even a pardon, when they'd be free to seek out their own fortunes, exactly as father had dreamed all those years ago. In the meantime, he meant to keep his head down and do as he was told. At least he retired with a bellyful of bread and soup every night, which was more than he'd had in the prison in Scotland. And while hanging by the neck until dead was still a threat, when he lay in his hammock in the warm night air, the chill grasp of death around his throat seemed as distant as faraway Scotland. 3. "I can help you escape," a soft voice said, though it carried all the way across the road, for the man who must have spoken stood before a butcher's shop with his arms folded across his apron, clearly the proprietor of the place. Ben's brothers ignored him, Dunstan because he was too busy trying to keep Tor on his manacled feet, while Tor swayed, blood from last night's lashes seeping through his parti-colored slops. As if the lashing wasn't punishment enough, he was forced to dress like some medieval jester and work as hard as anyone else while wearing chains. All for telling the truth, that the prison walls the engineers had designed would fall over in the first winter storm. Ben should have spoken to the guards instead. Not Torsten. It still might not have done any good. The engineers did not deign to listen to the concerns of mere convicts, master stonemasons or no, but Ben might have saved him the whipping or the chains. "I know where there's gold to be found. Gold no one else knows about. Come with me and you can be rich. Rich enough to buy your passage home, and never work a day in your lives again. No more irons and no more lash ever." There was a darkness in the butcher's tone now, as if he recognized Torsten's pain. Perhaps he had. Plenty of convicts had been granted a pardon in the last 5 years. Everyone on Ben's ship had at least earned their ticket of leave. Except the 3 Stone brothers, still as much prisoners as the day they'd arrived. "More gold than you can imagine," the butcher crooned, a faraway look in his eyes. "Enough gold to buy their freedom and passage home? Maybe even enough for Ben to pay to learn to paint properly?" Ben shook his head. It was a dream, a false promise. No one else was listening to the butcher. Maybe everyone else knew he was a madman who said nothing but nonsense. "Nonsense," Ben said. "If you had that much gold, why would you share it with anyone? Slavery's illegal, old man, for that's what it would be for anyone who accepted your offer." "No, I would share it. There is enough for all those who help me protect it. I promise you," the butcher insisted. "Where is this gold?" Ben challenged him. "Victoria? They don't let convicts in there. You need papers for that." The butcher shuddered. "No, not Victoria. The gold is here. He stamped his foot on the road, as though it was buried beneath their feet. No one's found gold in Western Australia. I'd have heard about it if they had. Ben scoffed. He would too. Fremantle was as full of gossip as any village in Scotland. The butcher laid his finger beside his nose. Not if it is a secret that only I know. He glanced around, then dropped his voice. Meet me here at midnight on Sunday night, and I shall show you. He scanned the street one more time before hurrying inside his shop. Ben, what are you doing there? Get over here and help me with Tor. I think he needs to see the prison physician. Ben dutifully headed back to help Dunstan with their brother. Between them, they hauled him home to his hammock in Scott Buildings, his chains clinking ominously with every step. 4. Sunday dawned bright and sunny, a perfect summer's day if he'd been in Scotland. But it was winter in Fremantle, and the wind had a bite to it. Sadly, not a big enough bite to blow over the walls Tor was still swaying about. Two of the warders' families were picnicking by the beach, while the older boys waded into the shallows with their fishing rods, declaring they would catch a shark for supper. Ben considered asking if the boys could fish somewhere else, or even just ignoring them. His painting was almost finished anyway. Finally, he decided the boys belonged where they were, both on the beach and in his painting. It would take longer to finish, but it wasn't like he wanted to go back to Scott Buildings anyway. Better that he work on this commission and enjoy a day in the sun. Watercolors suited the washed-out winter sky and the ships anchored in Gage Roads, the shipping channel that separated Fremantle from Rottnest Island, which he'd seen as a shadow on the horizon on clear days. Not today. He wished he had oils for the boys though, to better distinguish one from the other. As it was, they all looked alike, brushed into the landscape in browns, a foreground to the shingle-topped buildings across the bay. The commissariat held pride of place, with its blood-red sheer oak shingles rising above all others in town. It had been the first building he'd worked on with his brothers, but not the last. They'd built half the town from the streets up, including the soon-to-be-opened new prison. Not alone, of course, hundreds of other convicts had joined them, before getting their tickets of leave and heading out to find employment elsewhere in the colony. That looks lovely, a woman's voice said. Ben glanced over his shoulder to find one of the warder's wives standing not an arm's length from him, holding out a cup of tea. He took it, nodding his thanks to the woman. I've told John the first want him to hang it over the fireplace so I can see it every day, she continued. Especially with my boys in it. I never had a painting of my family before. I thought that was just for lords and ladies and things. Ah, so this was the wife of the warder who'd commissioned the piece. A brave woman, traveling halfway across the world with her husband to start a new life in a new colony. Like Pamela would have if she'd lived. Ben sighed. Pamela would have been in raptures, wanting to draw every waking moment she was here. She talked of finding gold too, just like the butcher. Maybe he wasn't so mad if someone as educated as she was knew gold was to be found here. If Pamela hadn't died, perhaps he would have come here with her and their children to paint and picnic and… If only he'd been home that night, instead of out with his brothers. Maybe he'd have been able to save her. If only… We should ask him to paint a wedding portrait of our Vicky when she gets married, one of the warders said. Vicky's only 7. He'll be long gone by the time she weds, his wife scoffed. Not this one or his brothers. Murderers, all 3 of them. They killed a woman back in Scotland. Right horrible murder it was, had even her lord father in tears when he talked about it before the magistrate, I heard. Men like him are the reason we're building that big new prison, with walls high enough to keep them in, away from our families. Some of the convicts serve their sentence and get pardoned, but the real bad apples like this one will be convicts for life. Can't trust them around normal, law-abiding folk. Don't know why they didn't just hang all of them instead of sending them all the way out here. The warder's wife had vanished, no longer brave enough to stand at Ben's side. Ben closed his eyes. Maybe he'd had enough sun for one day. "The painting is finished, sir," he said. "If you'd like to see it." The watercolor met with the warden's approval, and the warder was only too happy to take Ben back to the prisoner barracks, where he was issued with extra rations for the work. Ben merely tucked the bundle under his arm and went to find his brothers. 5. The convict barracks were empty but for the Stone brothers, and a guard posted by the door. Ben was surprised for a moment, until he remembered that the rest of the convicts had been sent on work parties out to York or Champion Bay, leaving space for the new shipload of convicts due to arrive any day. He'd wondered why they hadn't been added to one of the work parties, but now he had his answer. For all his dreams of freedom and his plans of one day meting out true justice to Pamela's murderer, he was doomed to die right here within the prison walls he and his brothers had built. He hoped Tor was right about the walls falling down in a storm, because there was no way they'd ever escape from this place otherwise. When the prison was finished, the inside of those walls was all he'd ever see. Forever. Dunstan had saved some dinner for him, which Ben ate quickly in between telling them what he'd heard at the beach. "We're going to die here. We've been building our own tomb," Ben finished. No response. Not one word from either of his brothers. "Well?" he asked. Dunstan shrugged. "If I could go back in time and you'd never looked at that girl." "Don't you blame Pamela for this. Even if I'd never met her or spoken a word to her, there's no saying that Lying Cove wouldn't have killed her anyway and still left her poor body in our house, or in the quarry or the castle, or somewhere that would have made us look guilty. Maybe if you two hadn't insisted we go out to see that oracle that night, Queen of the Kelpies or whatever she was, we'd have been home, and when she came to us for help, we could have defended her against that bastard, before all four of us took ship for this very colony, as free settlers instead of in chains." Ben kicked Tor's manacles, which jingled for a moment before they fell silent. Tor gave a shudder but said nothing. His eyes were glazed over, unseeing, but he didn't seem to have a fever. Ben looked askance at Dunstan. "That's our future. They've broken his spirit and you and me are next," Dunstan said. He sighed deeply, as though he'd already given up too. "No. Ben would not allow it. We have to escape. Before they lock us up in that prison forever. Escape while we still can. We should go meet with that butcher tonight. See what he has to offer." "The madman who was shouting in the street?" Dunstan shook his head. "Don't be a fool. We're fools if we stay here when we have a chance to escape. How long do you think Tor will last like this? We have to take our chance now before the walls are finished and they close the gates with us inside." Ben eyed Tor's manacles. "We'll have to get those chains off him, or they'll make too much noise and give us away." "We can't. What are they going to do to us if they catch us? We're already facing a lifetime in prison, which is no life at all. I say we go see the butcher. At least listen to what he has to say." Ben moved to the window. With only one guard, no one would be watching that. He'd be out the window and over the wall before anyone was the wiser. "No, wait, I'm coming with you," Dunstan said. "Bring Tor too." 6. A candle burned in the butcher shop window, so Ben knocked at the door, which opened at his touch. The butcher was expecting them then. "Come down to the cellar." The butcher beckoned from behind the counter. Ben and his brothers had no choice but to follow him down the stairs and between the shadowy carcasses that hung from the ceiling to what appeared to be a privy. The butcher put a finger to his lips before he lifted up the bench seat to reveal a ladder, leading down into the darkness. The brothers glanced at each other. A secret chamber beneath a cellar full of death? This did not bode well. "If the guards come past searching for you, they will not find you here. I'll be right down after you, I just need to get some refreshments," the butcher said, hurrying away. The sheep carcasses swayed in his wake. Dunstan shrugged. I'll go first. Tor, you come next, and if it's safe, Ben, you come down after. If it's not safe, you're the best one to go and fetch the guards. Because most of the guards believed Ben to be a good lad who'd been led astray by his brothers. If he were to tell the guards something villainous was going on beneath the butcher's shop, he'd actually be believed, instead of lashed or clapped in irons, like Tor or maybe even Dunstan. Which would be his brother's fate if they weren't hanged for trying to escape, even if Ben was let off lightly. Ben prayed the butcher's offer was genuine and their future would hold freedom. Ben! Come down! Dunstan hissed. But the butcher was almost back. He set his tea tray down on the floor. Would you take the biscuit tin, while I carry the teapot? Ben held out his hand, tucked the biscuit tin under his arm and proceeded down the ladder. Dunstan could have built better than this rickety thing with his eyes closed, Ben thought as he made his way carefully down the crooked rungs. He was no carpenter and he could probably do better. But when he emerged into the cavern below, he began to understand why. The place looked like the bottom of a mineshaft, wooden beams propping up the cut stone ceiling and holding up the walls. There were even hand and footholds cut into the limestone wall behind the ladder, as though the ladder was a recent addition to the place. Shelves had been cut into the walls too to hold dusty boxes, their contents hidden under canvas covers. Tor and Dunstan sat on the ledge of a waist-high empty shelf, legs dangling, but when the butcher held up the teapot, they sprang into action. They shifted the table in the corner over to their shelf, and dragged a bench along beside it, so they might all sit at table and have tea. The butcher produced cups from his pocket, and proceeded to pour generous servings. Ben set down the biscuit tin so that he might accept his cup. Drink, good sirs, and have a biscuit. Fresh from the bakery on Market Street, the butcher said airily, lifting the lid. Tor and Dunstan helped themselves, but Ben declined. He'd had his fill of them on the picnic by the beach, and they'd left a sour taste in his mouth. Tell us about this gold you found, Ben said, crossing his arms. Where in Western Australia did you find it? The butcher grinned. Why, it's right here, of course. He reached for one of the boxes and removed what Ben realized was not a cover, but a folded-over sack. Take a look for yourself. Gold nuggets tumbled out on the table, gleaming in the lantern light. Dunstan snatched up a fist-sized piece and bit into it, then grinned. It's gold all right. He reluctantly set the knobbly nugget back on the table with its fellows. Ben's gaze swept the table, measuring the size of the sack, before he counted the boxes lined up along the walls. If they're all full, that has to be close to 500 pounds of gold. And you found all that here, under your house? The butcher tapped his nose. If the governor only knew, eh? He'd have you convicts digging up the roads instead of building them. But that's why I need good stonecutters and carpenters. Strong men who know how to cut stone and shore it up, willing to work hard and keep my secret. Men who are good in a fight, who'll defend my gold like it's their own, because a part of it will be yours. A percentage of all the gold you dig up. What kind of percentage? Ben asked. Usually it would be Dunstan asking the questions, but since their arrest, his oldest brother had lost some of his spark, along with his heart, if what the man mumbled in his sleep was true. If we're doing all the work, it seems we should get no less than equal shares in this venture. A quarter share for each of us. The butcher laughed. That sounds fair. Let us shake on it. He held out his hand to Ben. Ben didn't want to take it. No one gave in that easily, not without bargaining. There was something wrong here. I would need it in writing, Ben said. The butcher produced parchment, a pen and ink, and Ben quickly wrote out the simple contract, then signed his name at the bottom, commanding his brothers to do the same, before pushing the paper toward the butcher. You too. William Silas Pierce scratched out his name, then handed the paper back to Ben. So we have a deal. Let's drink to it, eh? He seized the teapot and refilled Tor's and Dunstan's mugs. His own and Ben's were still full. All four of them raised their cups, clinked them together and drank. The tea tasted like tar, bitter as it coated his tongue before burning the back of his throat, all the way down. Ben gritted his teeth and drank it anyway. Tomorrow he would make sure he was in charge of brewing the tea properly, not this butcher. Pierce rose from his seat. I imagine you men might like a good night's sleep before you start work in the morning. The cellar is yours, no guard will think to look for you here. Ben glanced around. Where did the butcher expect them to sleep? There wasn't even a hammock, or anywhere suitable to hang one. No blankets. It might not be as cold as Scotland, but it was still winter in Fremantle, and the nights did have a chill to them. But Tor and Dunstan were already stretching out along the shelves, using their small sacks of belongings as pillows. They must be feigning sleep, so the butcher would leave and they could talk. Yes, that was it. Ben tucked the signed contract into his sketchbook, then buried it deep at the bottom of his sack, before setting it on an empty shelf for his pillow. He'd just lie down for a moment, until the butcher left them alone. Pierce tipped the contents of his own mug out on the floor. He hadn't drunk any of it, Ben realized, before collecting the cups and the teapot and heading up the ladder with them. He left the lantern on the table though. Ben waited until he could hear the man's footsteps dying away before following him up the ladder. The privy seat lifted easily. If they wanted to escape, they could. Which made no sense, for the butcher had left a whole bag of gold down there with them. With convicts. Whichever way Ben looked at it, none of this made sense. If there was gold to find in Fremantle, he and his brothers would have dug some up by now. If the nuggets were real, then they hadn't come from here. Maybe that's what the butcher wanted, free convict labor to build tunnels under Fremantle, where they wouldn't find any gold but would keep digging in hope of it. Pierce evidently thought they were idiots. Well, he'd show Pierce was the fool here, not him or his brothers. One sack of gold would set them up with farming land, just like they'd wanted. Perhaps not here, where their faces were too familiar, but maybe in Adelaide, or one of the other eastern colonies. Dunstan, Ben hissed, shaking his brother's shoulder. Dunstan only snored louder. He didn't wake. Nor did Tor, even when Ben shouted in his ear. That's when drowsiness began to steal his wits too, and he realized there must have been something in the tea. The tea Pierce had not drunk at all. Cursing, Ben barely made it to his makeshift bed before the drugged tea dragged him down into the darkness. 7. Rochelle took a deep breath. She was going to finish editing this footage, then submit the assignment, for which she'd get top marks, so she'd definitely pass this unit and all her others so that she could finally finish her degree and graduate at the end of the year. The power of positive thinking. Or was it the laws of attraction? She'd listened to enough podcasts telling her how to turn her luck around. Surely she was due some good luck soon. Right. She tapped the icon for her video editing software. File not found. You'd better be bloody joking. Not again. She dug into the menu, looking for it in her list of recent files. Yes, that was the last file she'd worked on. She tapped the file name. File not found. She'd done everything right. Saved it in the cloud drive, backed it up on her laptop, even kept backups of the unedited footage, but they were gone. Even running a search on her hard drive came up with nothing. Fuck. Please, no swearing in the background. I'm about to go live, and you know if there's too much swearing, I'll get another community standards violation. If I get too many of those, they'll ban my channel and we'll lose all our sponsors and ad revenue, and have to start over. Yes, she did know that. He'd told her often enough. Sorry, Jacob. It's just that the video files for my assignment are all gone. A loud, dramatic sigh came from the spare bedroom, which Jacob had set up as his computer den. It's Iago, babe. Don't use my real name when I'm working. Yes, because the world would end if his teenage fans discovered he had a name as ordinary as Jakob. Or they might track down his address and come banging on the front door, fangirling and demanding autographs. Or they might simply get confused and stop watching, which meant less ad revenue and financial ruin and other such things. Sorry. I'm just upset. I can't find any of my files. Can you take a look? You're the computer whiz, after all. I'm hopeless, as evident by my managing to lose my assignment again, days before it's due. Jakob, she couldn't think of him as Iago even if she was supposed to call him that, gave her a pitying look. Not when I'm about to go live, babe. They dropped a whole heap of new content today, and my fans are dying to hear my take on it as I show it to them for the first time. They're counting on me. Which meant she couldn't count on him helping her at all because after he was done playing games and broadcasting it on his channel, he'd stay on to argue with anyone who commented until the early hours of the morning, before he finally went to bed and slept until afternoon, when he'd wake up and start this all over again. She had no choice but to go and see her lecturer, to ask for an extension. If she took in her laptop and actually showed him that the files were missing, maybe. Who was she kidding? She was going to fail this unit like all the others, and then they'd kick her out of university, and she'd be stuck working in a coffee shop for the rest of her life. Well, if this bloody pandemic ever ended and coffee shops could open properly again, instead of this takeaway bullshit, where the cafe owners made minimal profit unless they pretty much worked for free, employed no staff and triple sanitized everything. She'd heard Tacy complain about the restrictions often enough. Ew, maybe Octavia, Tacy's sister, could help. She was doing a double degree with computer science after all, and occasionally worked an IT help desk when she wasn't operating the espresso machine. If she stopped by the Shut Up Cafe on the way to uni, she might be able to catch Octavia and recover all her lost work. It'd be so much easier if Jakob would only help her, like he used to do. Before he was internet famous, when they were both students together, he spent hours loading all the right software onto her laptop and setting it up for her. No problem was too big, he'd have done anything for her. Where's now? No. 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 You stupid fucking cunt. I told you to cast a spell, bitch, not kiss his ass. If you were real, I'd take all your armor off and spank you with your own sword until you bleed. Rochelle sighed. She knew he was actually shouting at his own scantily clad female avatar in the game, but sometimes, when he'd been gaming for several days straight, he got them mixed up and started shouting at her like that too. It didn't help that she'd cosplayed his avatar at a convention last year, and he'd gotten so excited he'd actually tried to spank her. She shuddered at the memory. She knew there were women out there who liked that sort of thing, or at least a whole lot of romance heroines who claimed to, but she'd happily lost the costume that very night, and archaeologists would stumble across the Holy Grail before Jakob found that metal bikini again. Even if he did, there was no way she was wearing it again, and this time, the sword was definitely going up his ass before it went anywhere near hers. See how the fans of his livestream liked watching that. Jakob's screaming rant continued, so she headed outside to do what she always did when life got too frustrating. She rid their yard of rocks. It didn't matter how many she picked up, there were always 100 more waiting for her. Tiny limestone pebbles, some as small as her fingernail and occasionally one as big as her fist. She wasn't sure if people threw them over her aging limestone wall, or whether they fell off the wall of their own accord, sick of hanging in the air for more than a century. Tonight she filled her pockets with pebbles, then straddled the wall. From here, she could see right across Fremantle all the way out to sea. Or across the Art College Oval to the buildings beyond, depending on which direction she faced. This time, she turned toward the school, or more accurately, the road that separated her back fence from the oval. The road was a sea of puddles, stretching right across the road. If she angled it just right. Rochelle skimmed a stone across the nearest puddle. It skidded through the water, sending up a small wave on either side until it hit the curb and stopped. Her second stone bounced up onto the footpath on the other side. The third one hit the low wall on the other side of the road, then bounced back into the puddle with a splash. God, she couldn't even do this right. Maybe it was time to give up on all those dreams she'd held onto since high school. Becoming an innovative filmmaker. Splash. Uploading short videos that went viral. Splash. Creating something that made people feel. Splash. Showing the world something they hadn't seen before. Splash. Walking the red carpet with her parents at her premiere. Splash. She didn't need a rock to shatter that particular dream. Breast cancer had done it for her, when it grabbed Mum and didn't let go until she was a shadow of herself in the hospice. She'd been in her first year of uni then, when she'd lost Mum, and that's when her bad luck had started. Mum had believed in her dreams more than even Rochelle did, and without her, it was hard to find the enthusiasm for something when she was barely hanging on to a passing grade with her well-bitten fingernails. She wished with all her might that someone would help her instead of shouting at her. The last stone sailed right across the road, over the wall and down onto the school oval, out of sight. Oh God, what if she'd hit someone? It was late, and she couldn't see anyone playing sports on the oval right now, but what if some homeless person was sleeping in the shelter of the wall and been injured by her rock? She held her breath, listening, but no one appeared. Rochelle sighed and let her remaining rocks drop to the garden bed. She should probably go to bed instead of waxing miserable about losing Mum. No, she didn't need anyone else's help. She just needed a good night's sleep so she could think straight and sort things out for herself. Maybe even some of her hope and determination would creep back in overnight. She'd need all her skills of persuasion to talk the lecturer into giving her an extension if Octavia couldn't save her. 8. Pain sliced into Ben's chest and he let out a scream, flailing his arms until he hit flesh, and something went clattering away across the stone floor. A man swore and stomped away. Ben jumped to his feet, his head darting from side to side as he took in the room. His brothers lay where they'd fallen asleep on the shelves, only now their chests were bare, with a bloodied circle on their left breast over their hearts. Or where their hearts should be, he realized, as he took in the 2 bloody lumps on the table. Tor. Dunstan. Neither man drew breath. You've killed them, Ben shouted, lunging for the butcher. But Pierce had retrieved the knife, which he now brandished between them with the sure grip of a man who knew how to wield a blade. Until Ben kicked it out of his hand and followed it up with a fist to the man's face. He might not have his brother's muscles, but he was the best fighter out of the 3 of them. And he was no honorable gentleman. Convicts fought dirty, and Ben could hold his own with any of them. He soon had the butcher on his back on the floor, gasping for breath. Where did the gold come from? Ben demanded, setting his foot on the man's throat. Williamstown, Nelson, the man gurgled. Not Fremantle then. Likely stolen from its rightful owner before being hidden here. So much for Ben's dream of taking a bag of it and fleeing with his brothers. Even if he were to kill the butcher and leave now, someone would still chase after him. He'd never be free. But this man, this butcher, had killed his brothers. He deserved to hang for his crimes, even if it meant Ben spent the rest of his life in prison. He had to go to the guards and bring them back here. Ben scaled the ladder, shaking his head to clear it. Whatever the butcher had put in his tea was making him lightheaded. He climbed out into the cellar only for the butcher to catch his foot, nearly upending him. Ben kicked behind him, then kicked again until the butcher let go. But Ben didn't stop there. Another kick sent the man tumbling off the ladder to the ground, and he didn't get up again. Ben slammed the privy shut and staggered out of the shop and into the street. Help! Murder! He cried, trying to run, but he couldn't seem to catch his breath. couldn't seem to stay on his feet. He felt himself falling, and he was helpless to stop himself from smashing face first into the street. He heard running feet. "It's a convict, fallen down dead drunk in the street." "Fetch the guards," someone said. Yes. Yes. The guards would come and help. They'd listen to him. They always listened to him. The stamp of boots heralded the guards. "Turn him over," one of them commanded, and rough hands rolled him until the back of his head hit the cobbles. Ben struggled to speak, to open his eyes to see which guards had come, but he could scarcely move. What had been in that tea? "Hey, is that blood? Bring the lantern closer." A pause. "It is blood. Looks like he's been stabbed. Better get him to the hospital, so they can patch him up. With a wound that deep, he won't make it to the hospital. Better take him up to the Skinner Street Cemetery, and bury him. He's dead already." Rough hands hoisted him up, swinging him between them as Ben tried desperately to tell them he wasn't dead. But no words came out, and he couldn't feel his feet anymore. Or his legs. Or anything. 9. "Hey Tacy, do you mind if I stick around for another hour or so I can redo the video footage I lost?" Rochelle asked. "Octavia couldn't help you then?" Tacy didn't look up from the massive coffee order she was assembling. Rochelle shook her head, then realized Tacy wouldn't see it. "No. She says the files have completely vanished. But I figure I did so many takes, I could probably retake them all in about a couple of hours. It's the editing and the effects that will take the longest." Tacy waved her hand. "Hey, if it's free advertising for my cafe, you can take as long as you like. As long as you make us look good." Rochelle forced out a smile. "Well, that's the aim. I'll fail the assignment if I make you look bad. Advertising is meant to make you look good. Then by all means, film anything you like." Rochelle started with some basic shots, close-ups of Tacy using the espresso machine, steam rising off cups, and the food in the glass cabinets. Then there was a bit of a lull, so Tacy offered to make lattes for them both, taking her time turning the milk froth on top into works of art. Of course, the moment she was finished making them, a rush of customers came in, all exclaiming over how pretty they were, and asking for latte art of their own. Rochelle carefully filmed each and every creation. She wasn't sure how to use them yet, but something told her she should. When she thought she had enough footage to work with, she sat down at one of the tables and downloaded everything. Then she started to edit and add special effects and... She jerked out of her reverie as her computer emitted an alarming beeping sound, as critical low battery error flashed across her screen. She fished about in her bag for the charging cable but came up empty. She cursed as she hurried to save her work before the laptop shut down. "Thanks, Tacy. I'll head home now so I can finish this off and submit it. Who knows? If my lecturer likes it, maybe you can use it on some of the cafe's social media accounts." Tacy laughed. "Yeah, thanks. This pandemic will probably be over by the time I get to updating our social media. Or business could pick up, and you can get us casuals to make the coffee again, so you can spend all of your days surfing the internet for your next hot date," Rochelle said. Tacy shook her head. "Oh no, I don't think I'll be dating again until Rory is. Or maybe not until she's finished high school at least." Rochelle couldn't remember the last time she and Jakob had gone out on an actual date, or even spent an evening together. Even before all the restaurants had closed for the pandemic, just going out for a movie or something. But that was different. They'd been together since high school and were hardly in the first blush of love. They were living together. Only one step away from marriage and forever, really. She sighed. Marrying Jakob didn't set her heart aflutter the way it used to. Maybe she was just too tired, working too hard to get this assignment done. Speaking of which, I'd better be going, so I can get this assignment in on time. Let me know if you need me to cover any shifts before then, Rochelle said, pushing the door open. When she got home, she plugged in her laptop and went to grab a glass of water. The furious clatter of Jakob's keyboard told her he was gaming, and she knew better than to interrupt him in the middle of combat with some monster or other. She opened the video file and set it to render, so she could upload it to submit it for assessment. When the rendering was done, she watched the final version, making sure she timed her transitions just right to match the music. Yep, it all came together perfectly. Hell, now she wanted to go back to the cafe for coffee. Maybe after she submitted the assignment, she could go get coffee with Jakob. She tried to pull up the university website, but her laptop insisted the site wasn't available offline. Which made no sense because she should be logged into the home Wi-Fi. She checked her laptop settings, then told it to scan for the Wi-Fi, but it didn't come up. Oh, there were plenty of networks from the houses and businesses around, as well as the school and the arts center in the old asylum, but not theirs. Jakob, she called, heading for the bedroom that was his gaming cave. Jakob, there's something wrong with the Wi-Fi. Could you power cycle it, please? God forbid she tell him to turn it off and on again, as if he didn't understand what power cycling was. He'd ranted for at least an hour last time she'd slipped up. No, the Wi-Fi's staying off. The only internet here is by direct cable to the modem, and I need all the bandwidth for my live stream. We're exploring a new area and I need it to run at the highest resolution, so everyone can see the graphics. Rochelle sighed. I just need it to submit an assignment. 5 minutes, that's all. If it's only 5 minutes, you can wait until I'm done. This is important. This is live, Shelley, and my fans are counting on me to show them all the new content. He mashed the keys, then continued, this is my livelihood here. Isn't putting food on the table worth more than some little project of yours? She couldn't remember the last time he'd bought food, prepared it, or even put something on the table she hadn't cooked. While she was this close to failing and being kicked out of uni for good. If I fail one more assignment, they'll kick me out, Jakob. I need to submit it, or I'll be nothing but a university dropout. Dropping out? The connection can't drop out. We're almost through the minions and up to the big boss fight. Jakob shrieked. Oh my God, you scared the shit out of me. Now go away and stop distracting me, Shelley. This is important. He actually made chewing motions, though his eyes stayed glued to the screen. It was like she wasn't even there. She didn't matter to him, and even her degree and her life weren't as important as whatever imaginary monster he could see on the screen. He didn't care about her or what she wanted, and as for marriage or partnership or some sort of forever. Forever being ignored and screamed at? No thanks. Rochelle wet her lips. It's over, she whispered. The moment the words left her mouth, her heart felt lighter. It's over, Jakob. Of course he heard that. His face turned red as his eyes focused on her, fury flaring his nostrils. It is not over. How can you say that? The fight is only just starting. Now get out of here before I have to spank your ass in front of all my fans for distracting me from this very important boss fight. It's not funny, Shelley. Can you see all the comments? They're flooding in. Every single one of my fans think you're being a brat. They want me to spank you. Now get the hell out, or so help me. His voice rose to a shriek, but she already wasn't listening. In fact, she'd marched right out of the house and into the yard, and she was perched on the back wall before his rant finally ended. 10. Dark. Couldn't breathe. So much weight on his chest. Ben shoved at whatever it was with his hands, then got his shoulders under it and heaved, before he heaved again. Something was shifting, and there was sand sliding down everywhere, like being buried alive. No. He refused to die this way. He had to avenge his brother's death. And Pamela's too. He had to live. Ben clawed and fought, inching ever upwards, until he burst into the cold night air in a shower of sand and grass. He'd never loved the scent of limestone dust quite as much as he did now, even if he was coughing the stuff up on the damp grass. He was alive. Alive and... "Someone help me." The words sounded in his head like the woman had whispered them right in his ear, but there was no one in sight. But he had to help her. If she needed him. "No, I don't need anyone's help." Relief coursed through him, though he didn't understand why. Whoever she was determined to help herself. He could respect that. If only Pamela had possessed such strength of resolve, maybe. No. Whatever fine qualities Pamela had possessed had perished with her. There was no use wishing otherwise. He needed to take stock of his surroundings, then make a plan. The guards would surely be searching for him. Unless they weren't, because they thought he was dead. He turned and saw what he hadn't before. He dug his way out of a grave. The guards had buried him alive. As far as they were concerned, he was dead. Which meant he was free to pursue whatever purpose he liked. First, he needed to find out where he was. This fine lawn did not look like the cemetery, and he didn't recognize the building rising up along the edge of it, nor the limestone wall between him and the road. He scaled the wall and dropped down onto a road made of smooth black stone. Odd. What sort of? Twin blinding lights appeared before him, the rumbling sound of swift wheels spinning on stone. But he couldn't hear the horses, nor could he understand how it could move so fast. The driver couldn't see him, he realized just in time, leaping to the side and out of the carriage's path. He expected to collide with the limestone wall, but instead he sank into it, like the cold stone was little more than water. He barely had a moment to marvel at the sensation before he was out the other side, tumbling over and over on the dew-damp lawn. Perhaps he should seek answers in the building first then, he decided, picking himself up. And possibly some clothing too, he added, glancing down at his naked self. The damn guards hadn't just buried him alive, they'd taken all his clothes too. Well, not that they were his clothes, not truly, for they'd borne the stamp of the convict establishment, however small, but Ben sighed. He would investigate the building, find some clothing, and venture back to the butcher's house, for surely that was where answers were to be found. The dark building beckoned, and as Ben strode across the lawn, a huge sign came into view, lit by lamps set in the ground. It was a College of the Arts, the sign said, and Ben laughed aloud. Had he died after all and gone to heaven? For the one thing he dreamed about, and wished for even more than coming to the Swan River colony, was that he might one day have the funds to be able to study art and learn to draw and paint like a true artist. No, fate liked laughing at him, as she likely was now, for daring to believe he might have a place in heaven, after everything he'd done. This art college must be real just as he was alive, though it seemed more miracle than sense. But Ben would seize this miracle and make it work for him, he swore, as he entered the hallowed portals of this mysterious art college. 11. When the sun rose, Ben slipped between the walls of the college as instinct told him he must, and it was not long before the corridors began to echo with footsteps. First, the confident strides of the tutors, which he was surprised to see were both men and women, though they dressed very much the same, as though the women tutors were required to dress like men. Then the students, uniformed in shades of blue, including a tartan skirt the length of a kilt, but worn by the girls. This art college was wondrously strange. He could scarcely understand half the things they said at first, until he grew accustomed to their odd accents, and even then, many of the words were unfamiliar. Yet he drank it all in, every word, every picture that appeared as if by magic on the screen at the front of each classroom, or on the equally magical slates each student appeared to possess. The classes were not just art either, history and geography and mathematics and science, the like of which he could scarcely believe. The lawn he'd been buried beneath was used for football matches, he found. Had the guards known they were burying him beneath a sports field? He hadn't heard a whisper in Fremantle of any kind of art college being built, but he could not deny the evidence of his senses. The school was as real as he was, and a veritable font of knowledge. The miracle of its existence didn't truly dawn on him until he was eavesdropping on one of the history classes, of all things. "Does anyone know when the gold rush began in Western Australia?" the teacher asked. She was one of the few women who wore clothing in a style Ben was familiar with, a shirt buttoned up to her throat, and a skirt that swirled about her ankles as she walked. Hands waved in the air, and the students began spouting numbers, which made no sense to Ben, or the teacher either, who shook her head at all of them. She tapped her fingers on her slate, and a picture appeared on the screen at the front of the room. Gold was first found in Western Australia in 1885 at Halls Creek, then at Southern Cross, then Kew, before the big discoveries at Kalgoorlie and Coolgardie that necessitated the Goldfields water supply scheme, a pipeline that travelled all the way to Kalgoorlie from Mundaring Weir in the hills just outside Perth. She couldn't have said 1885. Yet there it was on the screen, along with a series of dates culminating in the finishing of the pipeline in 1903. History to this teacher and her students, which meant... At the bottom of the screen, in tiny letters and numbers he'd never paid much attention to, he saw the time, followed by the date. Today's date, if it could be believed. Ben's breath caught in his throat. The day Pierce had butchered his brothers had been June 1855. The screen told him it was still June, but in the impossible year of 2020. 165 years had passed, while grass grew over his grave and an art school rose up beside him. No wonder fashions had changed, and the children's slates worked like magic. If he'd been born into this day and age, instead of raised under the reign of Queen Victoria, would he have sat in this classroom, drinking in knowledge the like of which he could scarcely imagine? Worse, he'd been right. There was gold to be found in Western Australia, and if he hadn't been imprisoned and then buried, he might have been the one to find it. Fate must be laughing loudly right now. Ben's thoughts spun. So much had changed in the century and a half he'd been buried. He couldn't even begin to imagine how he was alive right now. The butcher must have cast some sort of spell over him, which would not only explain his immortality, but the ability to walk through walls and the wings that appeared and disappeared at a thought. Not that he'd had much cause to use the wings, what with staying inside this school and all. Why had Pierce awoken him? Why now? For if the butcher could turn Ben immortal, then surely he'd already performed the same spell on himself. Which meant Pierce was probably looking for him, and if Ben intended to seek vengeance for his brother's deaths, then he needed to know as much as possible about life in this time, for Pierce was surely as comfortable here as he'd been in 1855 Fremantle. So Ben haunted the school, a sort of corporeal ghost, soaking up all the knowledge he could and observing the people of this time. The students reminded him of himself during his school days, easily distracted, bored, not realizing what a treasure knowledge could be. And the teachers, he kept getting distracted by the revelations each tutor seemed to be able to deliver in such a constant stream it left him breathless. He felt wrung out, his brain about to burst out of his skull, when he went searching for something familiar. He nearly cried when he stumbled across the art studio, a room full of students sketching with pencils, painting with palettes and brushes, and some even with pastels. Ben wanted to scream in triumph. This was the kind of art college he dreamed about, and here they taught art to children. For a whole day he feasted his eyes on all the art being created, until the children had departed and the sun began to set. Then he surrendered to temptation, taking a box of pastels and a drawing pad for himself, before marching up to the hill behind the school to indulge in a bit of art of his own. 12. Staring out at the school oval watching twilight descend, Rochelle's heart turned to lead in her chest. It was over between her and Jacob. Why hadn't she seen it sooner? He didn't care about her anymore. He was already married to whatever game he was playing, and he didn't even see her past the scantily clad, sexy avatar he'd picked to fight for him. Game over for them. It really was. She couldn't stop the tears now, streaking down her cheeks like teenage boys doing a dare on a late-night Macca's run after the Year 12 ball. Okay, maybe her tears didn't look like cold shrunken teenage boy bits as they ran naked through the dining room, but they still made her shudder and wish she could close her eyes and unsee everything. If only. She grabbed the top stone off the stockpile of rocks she kept up here and threw it as hard as she could. It flew clean across the road and bounced onto the oval below. One after the other, she hurled rocks until they were all gone. Only then did she bury her face in her limestone-dusted hands and sob a fresh flood of gritty tears. Without Jakob, she had no one. Mum was gone, Dad was still up north, managing the cattle station, and who knew when she'd hear from him next, seeing as he was out of range of all but a satellite phone most of the time, and even that was only for use in emergencies. Her feeling lonely and miserable was hardly an emergency. She should be sad or happy or something, but right now all she felt was angry. Angry at herself for not noticing sooner. Angry at Jakob for being so selfish, he hadn't even noticed her breaking up with him. A snort of laughter escaped, breaking through her tears. Oh God, she was going mad now. Upset and angry and laughing all at the same time. If anyone could see her. And that's when she saw him. Across the road, at the lookout on top of the hill, staring right at her. Rochelle wanted to shrink right down behind the wall and slink home. But this was her house and her wall, and she had every right to go mad here as much as anywhere else. Besides, staring was rude. What are you looking at? She snapped. He paused and cocked his head slightly. Why, admiring the beautiful view, of course. 13. She stared at him as if she didn't believe him. Well, perhaps she couldn't see it as well as he could. Come up here and take a look if you like. It's well worth it, he said, beckoning. The girl stiffened, her spine straightening out of that miserable slump as she drew in a deep breath. She was magnificent, from pitiful to empress in a single breath. You expect me to come up there? In truth, he didn't, though he would have liked it if she had. Then again, meeting strange men at night wasn't something good girls did, now or then, for some things hadn't changed. For all her delight in the picturesque, even Pamela would have hesitated. Not that it had saved her in the end. This girl, whoever she was, would not share Pamela's fate. Not if you don't wish to. Here, I shall come to you so I can show you, Ben said, covering the ground between them in several eager strides. She was the first person he'd spoken to since awakening in that grave. The first person who'd actually seen him. And if she could see him, then she deserved to see what he'd been drawing. He held out his sketchbook high above his head, for the wall she sat on was a foot higher than he was. For a moment he thought she might jump off the wall and run away, until she looked down at the paper. And gasped. You've been drawing the sunset over the harbor. The cranes and the ships and the water, all dark shadows and reflections in a blaze of orange. It's beautiful, she breathed, taking the sketch from him to peer more closely at it. Well, the view is, or it was. The color's fading now, he said, ducking his head. He wasn't sure he'd gotten the shade of the sky quite right, especially with the streaks of cloud across it. He was better with a brush and watercolors or oils than these chalky pastels, but the students had been learning to use them today, and his hands had itched to try them for himself. He couldn't imagine using pastels for a portrait yet, for he was nowhere near skilled enough for that, but a sweeping landscape, it was not his best work, but it was something at least. I wish I could draw like this. Create a form of art that doesn't just vanish into the clouds every time my computer hiccups, she muttered, handing the book back. He'd learned that the slates the school children used were sometimes called tablets or computers, and he'd seen them creating art on those too, along with their other lessons. But what kind of art vanished into the clouds? Art that could fly? He stopped to consider it. He'd learned of machines that could fly, so the thought of incorporating flight into art was wondrous. Why, if he were to fly up to the clouds, he could draw pictures like what birds saw from up high. He he needed to know more. "Please tell me more about your ephemeral art in the clouds," he implored. She laughed. "When you put it like that, it almost sounds like when it disappears, it's part of what I intended, instead of just stupendous bad luck. Well, my preferred medium is film. Video in all its forms, though mostly digital. I try to capture what's there with a lens, then after edits and effects and all sorts of things, make it into a movie that makes people feel something, or at least see something they didn't before. Even if it's for only a few seconds." She gestured toward his sketchbook. "It's not so much about skill in capturing the picture or the footage, as being in the right place and the right time to see it in the first place." Ben slowly nodded. He'd seen the students doing something similar, capturing images of each other on their slates, or with the smaller devices they called phones. Sketching something would be so much easier if he could keep a clear image of it on a device, to refer to later. Something ephemeral preserved forever. Or not forever if it disappears. "How does your art disappear then?" he asked. She frowned. "I wish I knew. I record it, I save it, and I back it up, and then when I go back to find it, it's gone, like I never saved it there in the first place. Sometimes I even get a heap of editing done, only for the files to vanish. Sometimes I don't even get to edit them. It's like I'm somehow deleting everything every time I turn on my computer, but I know it's not me. I don't do anything to them. They're just gone." "Maybe the clouds like your work so much, or they are jealous of your skills, so they steal it," Ben suggested. He'd known enough thieves in the prison, who'd had 1,000 reasons for why they stole things. Envy was a powerful thing when others had so much more than you did. She burst out laughing. "I'm only a student filmmaker and barely passing my classes, so I can't imagine anyone being jealous of me. Unless it was an AI, because even I can do a better job than most AI." She glanced behind her, at the house where Ben imagined she lived. "I should probably go inside and get some sleep, so I can get up early and submit my assignment on time. It was nice talking to you. Maybe if you're going to sketch the sunset again and you see me up on the wall, we could talk again? And you could show me more of your work?" All his other work was long gone, likely lost along with his brother's. All he had was one hastily smudged pastel landscape, and she'd seen that. But he could not disappoint a lady, so Ben mumbled something agreeable, before watching her slip off the wall and back into her house. Once he was certain she was out of sight, he hurried back to the school. He had a lot of work to do if he intended to show this girl what kind of art he could really create. For if she'd admired tonight's rough sketch, she could not help but be entranced by something more detailed. The sort of work that had earned him extra privileges in prison, or, before that, money to pay for their passage to the Swan River colony. It was only when he found pencils in the art classroom and began to sketch a fey maiden perched on a wall, that he realized he didn't even know her name. 14. Miracle of miracles, her video was still there the next morning, when she submitted it for assessment. But that didn't mean she could relax. She had one more assessment to submit for this unit, and it was the biggest of the lot. This assignment called for several short advertising videos of varying length, creating a story campaign. She'd been racking her brain all day to come up with something suitable for the Shut Up Cafe, which wasn't so cheesy it put people off. It didn't help that she couldn't get that boy out of her head, the strange one who'd been sketching the sunset. She wished she'd gotten his name or something, but the one thing that stuck in her mind was how intrigued he'd been by her ephemeral art. Because, that's exactly what a social media video campaign was. It was ephemeral, meant to last only a short time, but it had to loom large in people's hearts to move them, if only for a moment, so it stuck with them after the art itself was gone or no longer in view. Like a video that appeared in your social media feed. Or the picture on top of your coffee. That was it. All that latte art Tacy had created, did she still have the footage she'd taken? It had to be on her laptop somewhere, unless of course it had vanished into the cloud. 20 minutes later, half of them spent swearing, Jakob wandered into the kitchen and opened the fridge. Rochelle took a deep breath. Can you help me find some files that should be here on my cloud drive? I know I saved them. It came out sounded more whiny than she wanted, but it seemed to work all the same. Jakob plucked the laptop from her hands and tapped away at it. What files? There aren't any video files here. She peered over his shoulder. She'd known the stuff she'd filmed in the cafe was gone, but now it looked like even the assignment she'd submitted had vanished too. Good thing she'd already sent it this morning. They were all there yesterday, she began. He shrugged and set the laptop down. You must have imagined them. There's nothing here. But they were here and I can prove it. I was editing them last night. I submitted the final version this morning. The file names still appear in the editing software, see? Only when I look in the folder, they're not there. He was peering into the fridge again. Where's dinner? Shouldn't you be cooking dinner instead of fooling around on your computer, looking for videos that aren't there? I have a live stream starting soon and you know I need to eat before my blood sugar gets too low, because you know what happens when my blood sugar gets too low. He turned into a cranky, tantruming toddler, which was pretty much the case most of the time now. Besides, she was already annoyed that he thought she was imagining things. I'm not fooling around on my computer. I'm doing my assignment, which I need to do to pass this unit, so I don't get kicked out of university or lose this house, which I'm only allowed to stay in as long as I'm studying, in case you've forgotten. Besides, it's not my turn to cook. Tonight it's your turn, because I usually do torchlight tours at the prison on Friday nights. Rochelle folded her arms across her chest. Look, this really isn't working. When you moved in, we were both studying and both doing half the chores. Well, except when you were helping me with tech support, and then sometimes I cooked while you dealt with the computing stuff. But if you can't even cook dinner when it's your turn, and you won't even let me submit my assignments when I need to, so you can play games. My gaming live streams aren't just playing games. Between the ad revenue and the sponsorship deals, I'm the one bringing in the money here. Not you. If you don't cook dinner for me right now, you won't just lose the house. You'll lose me too, and then you'll be the biggest loser there ever was. Now make me my dinner, bitch, and I want it on my desk before I have to go live. Jakob flounced off to his den. I already told you it's over. I've already dumped your ass twice now, and you're too much of a loser to even listen, you lazy ass. She wrenched open the freezer. You want dinner? Fine. Have one of the frozen meals you make when I'm working nights. I'll put it in the oven for you, but when the timer goes off, it's your problem. She peeled off the plastic seal, tossed the meal in the oven and slammed the door. Then she raced outside to climb the wall before Jakob saw her burst into tears. 15. More than anything, Ben wanted to sketch the town of Fremantle in daylight, from high in the sky, but he knew he could not step into the sunlight. How he knew that, he could not say, but there was such certainty in his body's instinct to hide from the sun, that he didn't bother to question it. His instincts were rarely wrong and he ignored them at his peril, or worse, peril for those closest to him. Not that he had anyone left to imperil, but... A head appeared over the wall, before it was followed by a body. Ben's breath caught in his throat as she sat there again, legs folded beneath her like some sort of stricken elf, as she drew her arm back and pitched something clear across the road to the sports grounds below. I had hoped to see you again, Ben began, approaching slowly from the lookout, so as not to startle her. Do you come out here every night? No. Another missile sailed across the road. Well, I never used to, but now it seems like maybe I do. It's funny, I'm not someone who needs or wants to be alone, but it's not so much wanting to avoid people as avoiding one person in particular. We've known each other forever. We even went to school together and were best friends all the way through high school. We used to sneak over here to my grandmother's to hang out. Then she died and we became more, and he moved in, and now he just isn't the same. You went to this art college? Ben asked. She managed a small smile. Yeah, we did. I stayed with Gran during the school term, then went home for the holidays. Well, until Mum died. I think that's what did it for Gran really. When she lost Mum, she just sort of gave up. I just turned 18, so Dad let me stay here on my own as long as I was still at school, and then when I enrolled at university, he said I could stay until I graduated. Though I don't know if that'll ever happen. Women who attended university graduated just like men. Ben couldn't help but marvel at it. The university where you study film production, he said slowly. She bobbed her head. Yep. Though for how much longer, I don't know. I keep losing all the videos I film. I know I saved those coffee art videos. I'm certain of it. Wait. I was at the cafe and my battery was low. Maybe I didn't download them and they're still on the camera. Then all I have to do is download them and I can get started on the assignment. Wow, just talking to you made everything so much better. Ben ducked his head. Happy to be of service, though I don't believe I can claim much credit for you solving your own problem. Maybe not, but when I was upset about something back home, I'd go out to the yard, climb up on the fence and talk to the cows about it until I felt better or worked things out. There were usually more cows than people, and I was never upset at the cows. Ben laughed. Sounds like where I grew up in Scotland. Only for us it was sheep. Can't say I ever tried to have a conversation with one though. I don't remember them being very bright, or having much to say. She laughed too. I couldn't imagine having sheep up there, though some of the station owners did, and then they complained about the dingoes. Dingoes and wild dogs could take down a sheep, but they were much more wary around cows, so we never had the same kind of stock losses. Most of them sold out after too many bad years, but Dad's still up there doing his thing and presumably turning a profit. I honestly don't know if he expects me to take over one day, or if he means to sell the place when he wants to retire. I couldn't see myself running a station like that though. I'd need a manager if I could afford it. Or I could open it up to tourists as an artist's retreat, maybe. Artists who want to paint and film cows? Ben inquired. He couldn't quite imagine it, but he'd heard of stranger things. She just laughed. Maybe. City people like to get a feel for the bush and see a working cattle station even just once in their lives. But the colors up there, the red dirt and the low scrub, the mountains just sticking up out of nowhere, ancient like they've been looking down on the station since the world began, wondering what these cows are doing on their land. So many birds too, big ones, eagles and things. Oh, and the stars at night, it's almost like being up on the International Space Station, it's so clear. If you get a chance, you should see it. Blood-red soils, just like the stories had said. Maybe he should go and see it. Once he dealt with the butcher, of course. There are some working stations up near Coral Bay and Exmouth that are geared for foreign tourists. Plus there are beaches, and the snorkeling on Ningaloo Reef is unbelievable. She held her hands up about a foot apart. I once came this close to a shark bigger than I was. Luckily it was a reef shark, so it wasn't interested in me. I think it was as surprised as I was, so it swam off, faster than I could follow it. Pity. I would have liked to get a picture. A fearless lass who chased sharks in the water, in a world which allowed her to do such things. Ben shook his head. In all his wildest dreams, he could not have fathomed a future like this one. Or that he'd be here to see it. A shrill beeping sound came from the house behind her. She tilted her head, listening for a moment before she said, "That's Jakob's dinner. Not my problem." She dropped down from the wall and held out her hand for his sketchbook. "What have you been drawing tonight?" He'd been busy. This afternoon he'd climbed to the highest point in the school and stretched out beneath the roof, to try and sketch Fremantle in the afternoon light as it was today. Clouds had rendered the ocean as grey as he remembered the waters of Scotland, so he'd stuck to a pencil sketch, turning it all into shades of grey. He'd wait for a sunny day before trying to reproduce the scene in watercolor. But the beeping sound went on, and she grew increasingly uncomfortable even as she leafed through his sketches. "I'm sorry, I should probably go home and shut that off," she said, reluctantly handing back his book. Then she looked uncertainly up at the wall. "I didn't realize how high up it is on this side. Damn, I'll have to walk around, I think." She set off along the footpath into the darkness. "Wait, I'll walk with you." "To keep you safe," he said, hurrying to catch up. "You don't need to," she said, but he could almost feel the relief rolling off her in waves. So ladies walking alone were not safe now, any more than they had been in Ben's time. Sadness soured his mood. Maybe this future was not so perfect as it seemed. "It's no trouble," he insisted, for he felt the powerful pull to protect her. If he'd been there to protect Pamela. "What do you like to film when you're not trying to catch sharks?" he asked, falling into step with her. She gave him an odd look. "That was just the once, honestly. Underwater photography isn't easy, and everything moves so fast it's hard to film anything. But even with the shark, it's moments. I want to capture moments. Moments in time so I can preserve them forever. Which probably means I should become a wedding photographer or videographer, because that's all they do. But video, not photo, because I want to capture movement that just isn't there in a still shot. I mean, a photo is like one of those butterfly cabinets, with all the dead butterflies held in place by pins, or stuffed taxidermist creatures with glass eyes. But a film, you can see the creature moving, it's like it's still alive. I mean, there's heaps of pictures of thylacines, Tasmanian tigers, and even a stuffed one at the museum, but someone recently colorized a video of one of the last living ones in captivity, and when you watch it, it's like it's alive again, instead of extinct for more than 80 years. Almost like resurrecting it from the dead." She took a deep breath, then let out a breathy laugh. "Listen to me dribble on about raising the dead. I know that's not possible, but I'd like to film something that someone will look at in 80 years' time, so they'll feel like they've time traveled, if only for a moment. Traveling into the known past, instead of an unknown future. If Ben could have chosen which way he'd have gone, he'd have chosen the past, so that he could change things. Save Pamela and maybe his brothers too. Yet here he was, in "This is me." She gestured at the front door of a cottage that looked like it had been here since Ben himself had arrived in Fremantle. A spacious cottage by his standards, but so much smaller than the surrounding buildings. As if houses, much like the city itself, had grown over time. She reached for the door handle, then her eyes widened in horror. 16. Rochelle reached for the door, only to realize the knob didn't turn. She'd left her keys inside, and now she was locked out. And if Jakob couldn't even hear the oven timer beeping its heart out, he definitely wouldn't hear her knocking on the door. She'd have to dig out the spare key in front of this friendly stranger she still didn't entirely trust, and find a new hiding spot when he was gone. And soon, before Jakob's dinner burned and set off the smoke alarm. Rochelle took a deep breath, retrieved the key, and shoved it in the lock. As if by magic, the oven timer fell silent. Dinner was definitely burned. She wrenched the door open, to have it yanked out of her hand, and Jakob stood in the doorway, ready to explode. Which of course he did. "Where were you? Where have you been? Why did you let my dinner burn?" His nostrils flared, making him look more bovine than human as he scanned the street. When he caught sight of her companion, he curled his lip and roared, "Who's he?" Were you cheating on me with this dickhead while my dinner was burning? He shoved past Rochelle to stand toe-to-toe with the artist whose name she still didn't know. You think you can just come here and steal my girlfriend, noob? She grabbed his shoulder. Jakob, don't. I told you we're over and I was just talking to him. Jakob was twice his size. One punch and he'd pulverize the poor guy just for being nice. Jakob shook her off. Do you know who I am, noob? I'm Jakob Tolik, otherwise known as Iago, and I eat trash mobs like you for breakfast. Fuck off before I chew you up like toast. The artist just grinned. He set down his sketchbook and actually took a fighting pose with his fists up and everything. I never heard of you. Bring it, boy. Jakob would crush him. No, don't. Rochelle began, trying to step between them. Only for something to collide with her head, sending her deep into darkness. 17. The boy might be built like a privy, but he was clearly no boxer. Much like Ben had always been the smallest of all his brothers, but he'd easily been the best boxer. Quicker on his feet than Dunstan, quicker thinking than Torsten, with an artist's eye, he could see from the way a man's chest muscles moved as clearly as if the man had screamed it, long before he could land a blow. Which meant he knew where his fist needed to be and where his body shouldn't be, in order to win. The other convicts had thought him easy prey at first, but after he'd laid out a few of them in both fair and unfair fights, they'd soon learn to be wary of him and his brothers. This flapdoodle didn't stand a chance. Ben easily dodged the man's first blow and would have dodged the second, if she hadn't somehow entered the fray. Ben didn't think, he just reacted, putting himself within the foozler's reach to protect her. Only the fool jerked back in panic as Ben moved in, windmilling his arms to keep from falling over. One meaty fist collided with her cheek, and she went down, out cold from either his blow or the force of hitting the deck. Oh my God, you've killed her. This is your fault, the flapdoodle screeched, pulling out his phone. Before Ben could even deny such lies, the boy started speaking to someone on his phone. If he hadn't seen the students at the art school doing this, he might have thought there was some sort of magic at work. But right now, he didn't care about magic or science or whatever fueled the boy's phone. All Ben's attention was focused on the girl lying at his feet. Breathing, thank God, but bleeding from a head wound somewhere under her hair. Ben was no doctor, and she definitely needed one. If he only knew where to find one, he'd be off at once. I need an ambulance and the police too. Some crazy guy knocked on our door and when my girlfriend answered it, he hit her. She's unconscious and he's still hanging around. The boy aimed a kick at Ben. I'm calling the police on you. Don't you touch her. The boy gave his name and the address, before he rounded on Ben again. You did this, he bleated. You stay away from her, you hear, or you'll find out what they do to noobs like you in prison. Ben couldn't help it. He laughed. Oh, I know all about prison. Why do you think I escaped? And it seems to me that you're the one who hit her, so you're the one who should get arrested, not me. All I did was walk the lady home. The boy's eyes widened. You can't, you're... He dropped the phone and bolted off down the street. Ben considered going after him to haul him back to face justice, but he couldn't leave her. He couldn't let the police catch him either, but he couldn't leave her. Even just the thought of deserting her horrified him. He had to protect her. He didn't know how long he stood there, wishing he knew what to do, until the van pulled up, and two green-clothed women got out, wheeling a narrow metal bed. The nurses or doctors or whatever they were moved with ruthless efficiency, checking her over before moving her onto the bed and wheeling her into the van. Before Ben could decide whether to follow them or stay here to wait, a car with police written in blue along the side pulled up where the van had been. Ben swallowed. It was too late to run now, they'd only pursue him. And when they discovered he'd escaped from prison 165 years ago, Ben wasn't sure he wanted to know what they'd do. If they recognized him. For he'd known all the prison guards, and he'd never seen these two before. Why, one was a woman and the man was black. Yet both wore their uniforms with a confidence that told Ben there was no point challenging their authority. Times had changed, and he needed desperately to adapt to them. But he couldn't go searching for the butcher if he was back in prison. An idea began to form. A mad one, but no madder than most of the others that had worked out well for him. "What's your name?" the policeman asked. Ben swallowed. Jakob. Jakob Tolik." The man just nodded and wrote it down. Like he believed him. "What happened?" Ben decided to be a little braver. "She burned my dinner, so I got angry. I didn't mean to hit her, but she sort of got in the way, and she fell over and hit her head." The policeman eyed him with suspicion, as well he might. "What about the attacker? Dispatch said there was another man?" Ben swallowed again. "I made him up so help would come faster. She was unconscious and I didn't know what to do. I didn't mean to hit her." The policewoman exchanged a glance with her colleague, and the man nodded. "If you'll just come with us down to the station, we can get this sorted out." Ben closed his eyes for a moment. Back to prison, the last place he wanted to go. At least they didn't know his real name. 18. She's waking up. "Miss, can you hear me? Can you tell me your name?" Rochelle's head hurt, and what was that beeping? Was it the oven timer or the smoke alarm? She just needed it to stop. "Miss, can you tell me your name?" Rochelle squinted up at the woman in some sort of uniform. "I'm Rochelle Burke." "Do you remember what happened?" She cast her mind back. The oven timer worrying about the smoke alarm, Jakob fighting that kind stranger, then nothing. But if she had to guess. "I think someone hit me." "Do you feel well enough to speak to the police about it? Because they've been waiting." She really didn't, but it was best to get this over with. "Sure." She struggled to sit up, and found her headache didn't throb quite as strongly when she wasn't staring right up at the bright lights. A policewoman walked into the cubicle, then pulled the curtains back into place with a metallic scraping sound that set Rochelle's teeth on edge. She pulled a guest chair over so that she sat facing Rochelle and took out a tablet. "Can you tell me your name and address, please?" Rochelle sighed and gave her the details. "My partner and I were called to your home earlier this evening, because of a 000 call from a Mr. Jakob Tolik, who also resides at your address. When we arrived he was quite distressed, telling us he'd struck you and knocked you unconscious. He also mentioned something burning, but there were no signs of a fire. Can you tell us what happened?" Accepting responsibility for his actions. How unlike Jakob. Then again, if he said he'd hit her, then he probably had. The one thing more unlikely than him taking responsibility for his own actions was him taking the blame for someone else. It was his turn to cook dinner, but he had work to do, so I put something in the oven for him and set the timer, then went for a walk. When I came home, I heard the timer beeping, and when I came in, he was shouting and gesticulating wildly. Then something hit me and I don't remember much else," Rochelle said. "If your boyfriend hit you, then I would advise applying for a restraining order," the policewoman began. Rochelle closed her eyes. "He's not my boyfriend. He was, but I broke up with him, or I tried to, and he won't leave. All the more reason to get a violence restraining order. He won't be allowed to come near you, so he won't be able to hurt you again." Rochelle sighed. It didn't seem serious enough to need a restraining order, but if he hit you once, he will do it again. The violence only escalates until your life is in danger. The longer you stay, the less chance you'll get out alive. If the police were able to scare him enough to make him tell them the truth, then he'd listen to them when they delivered the restraining order. "All right. Tell me what I need to do to make this happen." 19. Ben expected to emerge from the police car at Fremantle Prison, amid the high limestone walls he and his brothers had hewn by hand, but instead, the policeman walked him into a brick building that sat between shops and eating houses, with only the police sign out the front to signify it wasn't the same as its fellows. And the cells, part cage, part ordinary wall, and they were empty. Ben breathed a sigh of relief. As soon as no one was looking, he'd be able to slip into one of the walls and be free. He spent exactly 16 minutes in his cell, according to the clock on the wall, before Ben made his escape. He waited for half an hour to see if anyone would realize he was missing and try to give chase, before he decided no one actually cared what happened to him, and slipped through the walls to the street outside. No one walking on the footpath seemed to notice him appearing in their midst. He was just another shadow in the night. "On High Street," one of the signs told him. The same street the butcher's shop had been on all those years ago. For the first time since he'd awoken, Ben began to feel hope. Hope that he might actually succeed in finding the butcher and justice for his brothers. 20. Instead of going straight home from the hospital when they released her, Rochelle asked the taxi driver to stop at the Shut Up Cafe, where she could see Tacy serving customers. "Hi Rochelle, what can I get you?" Tacy asked when Rochelle approached the counter. Rochelle took a deep breath. "I need somewhere to stay." Tacy's hand stopped wiping the counter mid-swipe. "Why?" The story just sort of spilled out. Everything except the artist. Until Rochelle finished up with, "So the police recommended I find somewhere to stay, until they have a chance to deliver a temporary restraining order to Jacob, and he leaves my place." Tacy winced. "I want to help you, I really do, but our place is packed to the rafters. I mean, there's me and Octavia and Rory, and with Sybil stuck in the Arctic, looking for ice mummies, we're storing her stuff, and Callie's housemates didn't make it in before the border closed, so she moved back in with us, in Sybil's room, when the lease ended. Seriously, I'd happily crash on a couch." "It'll only be a week or two," Rochelle said, her heart sinking. "I'd offer you the sofa bed if I could, but even that's not there anymore. We had to store it upstairs here to make space for Sybil's stuff. Octavia sleeps on it sometimes when she's working on a film project in the studio she's set up upstairs." Rochelle dared to hope. "So you might have space here?" Tacy stared at her for a moment. "Actually, that's not a bad idea. There's been talk of relaxing restrictions, so we can have customers sitting at the tables inside soon, and I was hoping to open the cafe at night again. Octavia usually handled the evening shifts, but she's taken a fly-in fly-out tech support role up north, so if you were willing to cover evenings at the cafe, I could let you stay here. There's no kitchen upstairs, so you'd have to use the cafe kitchen, but you'd have access to the upstairs staff bathroom and of course the sofa bed." Rochelle clapped her hands. "Oh, that sounds perfect. I could use Octavia's studio to finish my media project too. I don't know how busy the cafe will be in the evenings, or when we do reopen. We'll have to play it by ear, depending on how busy it gets. You might have to close early or stay open later. If no one turns up, we might have to give up on evenings altogether until business picks up again, but you can still stay, even if we're closed. Well, until you get this thing with your ex sorted. Didn't you say the house where you were staying before was owned by family?" Rochelle nodded. "It belonged to my grandmother. She put a condition in her will that I could stay in the house until I finished university. Whether that's because I graduate or get kicked out, who knows? Of course you'll graduate. Without your ex around making life difficult, I bet you'll do just fine. Will you need help bringing your stuff over? If you're willing to wait until I've closed the cafe and picked Rory up from school." Rochelle shook her head. Just the thought of subjecting a little girl like Rory to Jakob's mercurial moods or worse, more violence, no. Just no. I'll be fine. Most of my stuff fits in a suitcase anyway, so I'll pick a time when Jakob is live streaming, too busy to notice I'm there, pack what I need, and be back before you close in the afternoon. No worries. For once everything went as smooth as clockwork. Miracle of miracles, Jakob wasn't home, so it took less than an hour before Rochelle was back at the cafe, unpacking her things in the surprisingly large studio apartment above the cafe. Use my equipment if you want to. I won't need any of it while I'm away, and I've just updated the graphics card on my computer. It's bound to be better than your laptop. Rochelle jumped in surprise. Octavia? I thought Tacy said you were up north. Octavia grinned. I fly out again first thing tomorrow morning. Probably a good thing too, so I can get you set up here. Oh, and I've been thinking about your cloud issue, with your files vanishing and all. Once or twice I'd blame the software, but every single copy, everywhere you save it? No, that's malicious, either code or a person. I'd run a full system scan and change your passwords. I bet that fixes it. I've never done either of those things, Rochelle admitted. Jakob usually handles any of my tech support issues, and of course he has all my passwords. Octavia shrugged. Maybe he's been hacked and doesn't know it. Anyway, first thing you do is change your passwords. Right now. And I'll set you up an account on my computer while you're at it. Actually, she needed to change her passwords anyway. All of them were pretty much on the same theme, Jake and Shelley for Eva, because when she and Jakob had set them up, she had thought they'd be together forever. What an idiot she'd been. She couldn't have been more wrong if she tried. Tried and wrong, like Martha Rendell, the only woman they'd hanged at Fremantle Prison. A rushed trial with circumstantial evidence for murder that might not have been murder at all, yet they'd hanged her anyway. Because people believed in evil stepmothers more than they believed doctors could make mistakes. Well, Rochelle was done trusting the wrong people. She wasn't going to end up like poor Martha, and she'd set her new passwords accordingly to remind her. You look like you're thinking real hard. Passwords aren't that difficult to create, Octavia teased. Rochelle felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment. Actually, I was thinking about Martha Rendell. Octavia frowned. Isn't that the murderess they say haunts the prison chapel? The one they hanged? Rochelle drew herself up in full tour guide mode. She was convicted of murder and hanged less than 3 weeks later, though she proclaimed her innocence up until the day she died. And she doesn't haunt the chapel. You can see her image in the chapel window from outside on the parade ground, but you can't see her from inside at all. Octavia grinned. Ah, that put the spark back into you. Are you still running tours at the prison? Rochelle shook her head. They're closed because of the restrictions. Hopefully, with everything opening up, they'll be allowed to run tours again, and I'll get to dress up and jump out at people. Octavia shook her head. I still can't believe you get paid to pretend to be a ghost. I mean, the pay for doing IT support is good, but it's nowhere near as much fun as that. Well, I only get to be a ghost a couple of nights a week, and only when the prison's open for tours. While you're up north doing the superhero thing for people's computers, I'll be making a zillion coffees and trying to turn each one into a work of art, like Tacy does. Have you seen the froth kitten she did on that cappuccino the other day? I'm sure I took a picture on my phone. Rochelle fished out her phone and found the picture. Here. There's a kitten, dot and a swan, dot and a heart. As she flipped through the pictures, she found a video file. Oh wow, here's the video I thought I'd lost. My battery was low, so I must have filmed it with my phone instead and forgotten. This is exactly what I needed for my assignment. Octavia touched 2 fingers to her forehead in a mock salute. Well, don't let me keep you. You should be able to access everything on my computer just fine if you need to, and if you have any IT issues, feel free to email me. I might be stuck in a camp in the middle of the desert, but the internet access is better than the CBD office here. I should know. It's my job to make sure it doesn't drop out. Rochelle thanked her and wished her a good flight as she plugged her phone into her laptop to download all the coffee pictures and footage. By the time she'd started the transfer, Octavia was already gone. 21. When the sun rose, Ben slipped inside the nearest wall to watch High Street in daylight. Great big digging machines ripped up the road, destroying what would have been days of back-breaking labor by a convict work crew in a matter of minutes. There were no convicts present today, just men and women in eye-wateringly bright yellow and orange vests that dazzled in the sun. By day's end, they had reduced the black-topped road to rubble, hauled away by a massive truck as the workers paused for their midday meal, and dug down into the sand to reveal pipes as thick as a man. Pipes that looked aged, yet they had not existed when Ben had walked this street. If he hadn't spent so much time in that art school, soaking up as much knowledge of this time as he could fit into his head, he was certain his brain would explode from the realizations he was forced to confront now. The village of Fremantle he'd known had turned into a massive town, far grander than anything he could have imagined, which made finding the butcher an even more impossible task. Yet he would do it, if it took him a lifetime. He owed his brothers that much. As the sun sank, the work crew went home, fencing their digging machine in a metal cage open to the sky, as different people emerged on the streets. People ambling along, eyeing off the eating houses as they passed. Shops closed, and people took up residence in doorways. Ben took them for beggars at first, until they began to spread their wares. One man had a guitar, which he used to great effect, singing along with his strumming to a tune Ben did not recognize, though many of the passers-by appeared to, for they tossed coins into his guitar case. A pair of women spread out cloth-covered boards that displayed a dizzying array of beaded jewelry in all colors of the rainbow. But the stall that intrigued him most was where a man simply spread out a blanket, then laid sheets of paper across it like tiles. In the light of dusk, Ben could not see what was on the papers from across the street, so he emerged from his hiding place to take a closer look. The pages were filled with pen and ink drawings, caricatures that captured a face or a likeness with only a few lines. "Would you like me to draw you as a cartoon?" the man asked. Ben blinked. He'd never known another artist with the skill to be able to draw him, yet it sounded like the most decadent thing to be drawn by someone else. "I don't have any money," he admitted. The guy grinned. "Oh, that's all right. I'll just add you to my gallery then." He scrawled one line, then another on the page before him, and held it up for Ben's perusal. Ben gasped. He had not looked into a mirror since before he left Scotland, and yet here he was, immortalized in a few lines of ink. Dressed in the clothing he'd borrowed from the box marked Lost Property at the art college, he could have passed for one of the older students. No one would guess he should have been dead for more than a century. "That's $20 if you do decide to come back and buy it," the artist said as he slotted the drawing into the pattern made by its fellows. Ben nodded. He'd seen other people purchasing pictures from this man, so the price must be a reasonable one. "Do you make enough money to live off like this?" he asked. The man shrugged. "Before the pandemic hit, I was making more than $500 a night most Friday and Saturday nights. Double that if I set up in daytime near the markets, when there were tourists. Now it pays the rent but not much more than that. So I had to take a job up north, and now I only do this on my weeks off. Because I might just be a laborer at the mines, but I'm still an artist, and they can't take that away from me." Ben couldn't help but agree. They'd taken his freedom and his family and his home, but as long as he'd had charcoal and paper, even in a prison cell, he'd still been an artist. "If I do find a way to earn the money for it, are you here every night?" Ben asked. The man shrugged. "Only on the weekends, and only when I'm not up north. I'm due to fly out tomorrow, so I won't be back for another 3 weeks. Ben nodded. See you in 3 weeks then. He forced himself to walk away, his mind whirling with ideas. Perhaps he might have a place in this city after all. 22. It's not just coffee, it's art, Rochelle muttered to herself as she put the finishing touches on the ad campaign. Well, the ad campaign for her assignment, because she wasn't sure Tacy would want to use this to promote the cafe. It was cute and it was true, and the pictures of her coffee art creations were all kinds of wow, but the campaign just didn't seem enough. It'd need one hell of a glow-up to persuade her to really want to get a coffee here, and she loved Tacy's foam kittens. Maybe she needed a sort of intro scene, introducing the cafe in one quick pan before zooming in on the coffee. Rochelle grabbed her phone and padded downstairs into the closed cafe. The only light came from the street outside, reflecting off metal and glass and casting weird shadows all around. Well, it could work for a Halloween ad if she added some post-production bats and things. Rochelle laughed softly to herself as she panned around the room, then zoomed in on the espresso machine. The back of the machine reflected the street outside, and what looked like Batman standing under the awning across the street. Perfect for Halloween, even if it was still only June. She edged closer to the window, trying to get a better angle on the dude in the costume. Actually, from this angle, he didn't look like Batman at all. Like some huge guy with wings and horns, not a guy in a suit. Then a girl dashed into the shot, collided with the guy in the costume, before they both just vanished. Rochelle blinked, squinting at her phone screen before peering out the window. Yep, he was definitely gone. They'd probably just gone inside the building. After all, he'd been standing in the doorway. He'd probably pushed open the door and slammed it closed behind them while Rochelle had blinked. Because people could dress like superheroes or whatever, but none of those things were real. It'd make an awesome ad for the cafe though, if Batman or whoever he was got his coffee there. Rochelle shook her head. She'd take a closer look in the morning, and see if there was anything she could do with the footage. Clean it up maybe, because it'd be pretty grainy in the dark, and see if any of it was usable. 23. Rochelle shook her head. Whoever the guy had been cosplaying last night, it definitely hadn't been Batman. He'd had horns and wings for sure. She took a screenshot and ran an image search. The first few hits were for some sort of hoax in the United States about a Mothman. He had wings and antennae, not horns, but it was a pretty good match for what she'd seen. Only, Mothman comes to shut up cafe for coffee didn't sound as exciting as Batman doing it. Even if you could see the cafe logo on the window in the corner of the shot. Actually, the footage didn't clean up too badly. It was definitely clearer than some of the other blurry videos of the Mothman in other places in the world. Maybe she should post it online just for the hell of it. Before she could second-guess herself, Rochelle uploaded the video. For a caption she called it, "Mothman comes to Fremantle High Street for coffee." Then she went upstairs to get ready for work, because the restrictions were being lifted today. The cafe could allow people to sit inside at tables again, and Tacy wanted to open the place up at night too. Rochelle had promised to make herself available all day and evening in case she was needed, and it was looking like a lovely day outside. After 3 months of restrictions, she'd want to be out in it, enjoying a coffee and whatever else she'd been missing. She doubted even a Mothman sighting would stop most of the people of Fremantle from enjoying their newfound freedom. And she wasn't wrong. 24. When the cartoonist did not return the following night, Ben was there, ready to take his place. Armed with a selection of supplies he'd liberated from the art school, along with all the sketches he'd done since he awoke in this time, he had no trouble attracting the attention of passers-by. In fact, he hadn't been in business for an hour before he'd delivered no less than 3 commissions, in a style he felt was far more complimentary than the cartoonist's caricatures. When midnight came and he was the lone person left on the street, he packed up his stall, pocketed his profits, and set off to search for what remained of the Fremantle he knew. He followed High Street all the way to the hump of Arthur Head, still topped by the limestone roundhouse that predated the prison he and his brothers had built. Other structures from his time still lingered, sandwiched between more modern edifices of colored stone and glass and a bunch of brick buildings that spanned the time in between. Prison sat on its fortified hill, lording it over the town like a castle of old. It too had grown while Ben slept, sprouting new buildings and heightened walls, topped with sharp spiked wire that would deter even the most determined climber. But the butcher's shop was nowhere to be seen. Almost as though it had never existed, though Ben knew otherwise. He sighed. He knew the butcher would not be easy to find, but he'd hoped fate might smile on him for once. More than a century might have passed, but he was still the butt of fate's jokes. Not for long though. He was a free man, with money in his pocket and the means to make more, and if he knew anything about money, it was that the man who had it possessed infinitely more power than the man who did not. As the nights passed, he purchased new clothes, more in keeping with the current fashions he observed on the men walking the streets of Fremantle today. When his pilfered art supplies ran low, he patronized a stationer's shop, for he had no need to steal them anymore. A signboard on the wall covered in pieces of paper stuck to it with pins caught his eye. There were advertisements for art exhibitions and classes of all kinds. The one he could not look away from described a life drawing class, where students might sketch the naked human form. An evening class too which he might attend. "Can anyone go to that?" Ben asked, pointing at the poster. The shop assistant turned to peer at it. "Oh yeah, those art classes are up at the old asylum, the Fremantle Arts Centre. As long as you pay the fee, they're open to artists of all levels, from beginners to professionals." Ben nodded. If he found and dealt with the butcher quickly, he'd be free to pursue his true passion, and attend art classes like this one. Thanking the shop assistant, he scooped up his bag of purchases and headed back out into the night. 25. Rochelle should have known. Less than 24 hours after she'd posted that Mothman video, the bloody thing went viral, so the first evening the cafe was open, it was chock full of conspiracy nutters, monster hunters and people who were probably just curious, eager for a glimpse of the mysterious Mothman. The next morning, thrilled at the successful reopening, Tay-C decided to offer a prize for anyone who could capture another picture of the Mothman. That brought them in droves. Rochelle swore it was busier than she ever remembered it being, before the pandemic. Between helping Tay-C out during the day and manning the counter in the evenings, she barely had time to blink, let alone add anything to her assignment, so she submitted it as it was. She didn't trust the files not to vanish, though her cloud drive had been remarkably well behaved since she changed her passwords. She considered warning Jacob that he might have been hacked, but the police had been adamant about avoiding him as much as possible until she got a court date for the restraining order. She should have heard by now according to the police, but what with all the pandemic restrictions keeping the courts closed the last few months, there was a backlog of them to get through, so there was quite a wait. Which meant she'd be spending more time at the cafe, or in the apartment above it. The lack of a kitchen was annoying at first, until she realized she wouldn't have time to cook anyway, what with working mealtimes. Besides, there were usually leftover muffins and sandwiches at the end of the day, which meant she rarely had to cook at all. When her assignment grades came through, Rochelle let out a whoop of triumph. She'd gotten credits for both of them, which meant she might actually pass this unit. Maybe she'd be able to attend university next semester, after all. Maybe even graduate. She was so happy she nearly danced all the way downstairs to the cafe, and her smile just wouldn't leave her face. Not even when two pushy, entitled customers wouldn't take no for an answer. 26. Ben had just set down his satchel, ready to unpack his wares for the evening, when he felt the inexplicable urge to be elsewhere right now. Actually, not so much elsewhere as across the road and closer to the water. He didn't think. He simply slung the satchel back over his shoulder and set off in the direction his heart tugged him towards. He stopped outside a coffee house, its wide glass windows showing a brightly lit interior occupied by one woman, and a pair of men who appeared to be standing over her in a threatening fashion. Ben yanked open the door, gripping the handle so hard the hinges creaked in protest. One of the men glanced at him, frowned, then returned his attention to the girl behind the counter. "Why won't you go out with me?" he demanded. "In case you haven't noticed, I'm working," she said. He couldn't see her face, but he'd know the elf maiden's voice anywhere. "Just a kiss then," the man said. He sounded foxed. "We don't sell those here. Just muffins, sandwiches and coffee. Oh, and cookies. Might I recommend the macadamia brittle Afghans? Sweet and chocolate and chewy, perfect for keeping your mouth busy until your latte's cool enough to drink." Her smile hadn't faltered, though it did look forced. And there was fire in her eyes, like she was going to show them what one of her kind did to fools who displeased them. More than anything, Ben wanted to pull up a chair and watch the fireworks unfold, but he was too much of a gentleman for that. Unlike these two idiots. "Here's your coffee." She shoved 2 takeaway cups toward the men. "But we don't just want coffee. He wants you," the mouthy one's friend whined. "Like I said, I'm working. Maybe you'll have better luck at one of the bars or nightclubs up on the terrace. Enjoy your evening." She turned away from them to meet Ben's eyes, and a spark of recognition flared. "How may I help you, sir?" The mouthy one glanced at Ben again, and his expression went from dismissive to mean. "Hey, we're not done with you yet." A gentleman would have called these 2 idiots out to answer for their insults outside. But Ben never had been and never would be a true gentleman. With 2 older brothers who were bigger than him, he'd learned to play dirty right along with the alphabet. He grinned. "Yeah, you are. You've got what you ordered. Now go." Mouthy's mate looked him over. "Beat it, runt. Get back to time zone where the other kids hang out. But this is where they make the best coffee. And the best cookies." Ben smiled. He didn't care if the coffee tasted like tar, but he did like the sound of the cookies. "I'm hoping she'll be done with me before the police patrol get here, because it looks like they're ordering for the whole precinct, and that'll take forever. Luckily, they stopped to deal with someone who was drunk and disorderly, or they'd have beaten me here." Ben counted to 5 under his breath before the door slammed behind both of them. She squinted at him. "You're making a habit of this. Showing up when my bad luck's taking a turn for the worse. Are you some sort of superhero or something?" Superheroes. They were characters in the comic books some of the school students had. Ben shook his head. "Sorry. I'm no comic book hero. Just a man in search of good coffee and, did you say macadamia brittle cookies?" She laughed. "Actually, those cookies are stale and not supposed to be sold. But I kind of like them chewy when they're 3 days old. And they go really well with frothy milk, which is basically what those guys had ordered, topped up lattes with only half a shot of espresso. Oh, and when they're chewy, they tend to stick your teeth together, which I figured might shut them up for a minute." She ducked her head. "I'm sorry, I'm normally really nice and I've been in a good mood all day, but guys like that just bring out the worst in me. All the maturity of a 3-year-old, convinced the world exists only to pander to their whims." "Like, what was his name? Jakob Tolik?" Her expression darkened. "Yes, exactly like him. But he's not part of my life anymore, because all I seem to do now is live and breathe coffee, or the occasional tea or hot chocolate. Speaking of which, what can I get you? Oh, and I promise if you order a latte, I'll do proper art on top and not a dick." He blinked. Did she really just say? She closed her eyes. "You don't believe me. I know it's childish and I shouldn't have, but She unclipped her phone from the little tripod it had been standing on and swiped her finger across the screen. Here. I've been filming all the art for an ad campaign. Sure enough, she'd poured the milk in a pattern that looked exactly like an erect cock and balls, with a dusting of hair and everything. Ben couldn't help but laugh. That's very... He wasn't sure if he should say accurate or anatomically correct. She'd obviously seen the real thing to be able to represent it so accurately, but... Juvenile, she supplied. I know. I probably should have just stenciled a moth on it in chocolate powder, like I've been doing for everyone else tonight. Like I'll have to do if half the police precinct are coming in, seeing as we close in less than half an hour. Are they really headed here? Ben shook his head. I'm afraid I lied about the patrol. I haven't seen any police officers tonight. Which was a good thing, given he'd escaped his prison cell the other night. But I would like a black coffee, please. Just black. I'll provide my own art. He tugged his sketchbook out of his satchel. She smiled. One espresso coming up. She concentrated on the coffee machine, which hissed and steamed like some sort of angry dragon. This is how I drank my morning coffee in Italy. Now the art I saw there, just everywhere, centuries of creating the most amazing things and preserving it so it's still there. She shook her head. Have you ever been to Italy? Ben shook his head. I've always wanted to go. One day, maybe. She slammed both hands on the counter. You need to. Every artist needs to. The Sistine Chapel alone is worth the trip. I mean, you're only supposed to stay there for 15 minutes, but I managed to get in just before a tour group, so I got twice that, but I could have just lain on the floor looking up at that ceiling all day. Would you come with me? The words had left his lips before he'd thought them through, and all he could do was curse his stupid tongue for sounding as bad as the idiots who'd just left. But she wasn't looking at him the way she'd regarded them. No, she was thoughtful now. You know what? When the borders open, if I can scrape up enough money for the plane ticket, yeah, I would absolutely love to visit the Sistine Chapel with you. It'd be interesting to hear what you think, a talented artist seeing it for the first time. It's a date then. Modern words coming out of his mouth, he couldn't say where he'd heard them, but they seemed right somehow. He stared at her and she stared right back. After a long moment that stretched forever, she shook her head and broke the trance. She brought out a small cup of coffee and snapped a lid onto it. There you go. Ben stared at the tiny cup. Do you mind if I drink it inside the cafe, instead of taking it away with me? I'll sit over by the window where I won't disturb you, so I can draw. Sure. I should have asked if you wanted it here or to take away. I was just so flustered by the previous customers, I didn't think, oh, and you wanted a cookie too, didn't you? The choc chip are the best. Tacy made those fresh this morning, and I swear there's about as much chocolate as cookie in them. I don't know how she does it. She reached for the jar. Ben lifted up his hand to stop her. Don't worry about it. The coffee is fine. I'll come back and have a cookie next time. If you're sure. He nodded mechanically and moved toward the table, though every step away from her felt like he was wearing manacles, they were so heavy. Other customers came and went. In between, she cleaned the cafe, wiping a cloth over each of the tables before stacking the chairs on top of it. Then she flipped a sign on the door and headed for the coffee machine. Whatever she did to it made it steam and smoke and shriek, but the dogged determination in her expression told him she would complete her task, whatever it was, before she finished work for the night. His sketchbook and pencil were in his hands before he'd even really thought about it, trying to capture the elf maiden subduing her mechanical dragon. When she left to carry some dishes into the kitchen out the back, he made his escape, tipping his coffee into a nearby pot plant before slipping out the door to the street outside. But something made him tear the picture out of his book, and leave it behind for her. It belonged to her more than it did to him, capturing a private moment of victory that no one else but them knew about. Much later that night, when dawn's light touched the eastern horizon, he slipped inside the walls of the cafe, curious to find out what she thought of his gift, or if she'd even seen it at all. The table had chairs on top of it now, with no sign of his picture, so she must have liked it enough to take it with her. Satisfied, Ben headed for the roof, where he had only moments to take wing and fly to the school before sunrise confined him to the shadows again. 27. So how are the evenings going? Tacy asked. I mean, I can see from the figures that we've had a nice uptick in sales since the restrictions lifted, or maybe it was just because of your viral Mothman video, but that seems to have died down now. So, how are the evenings going? Really well. Almost like we'd never had any restrictions. Business as usual, only busier. She ducked her head, staring at the froth kitten on the side of her cup. Even the kitten's soulful eyes seemed to want to beg her to fess up. Of course we still get our share of entitled assholes, and more of them now the pubs are open. What happened? Do we need more security? Tacy asked instantly. And that was why Rochelle loved working for Tacy. She actually cared that her employees were safe, instead of dismissing their concerns. Then again, Tacy knew what it was like not to feel safe. Rochelle shook her head. It was just a couple of drunk idiots who caused trouble because I was here alone. The moment another customer walked in, they backed right off and left. But what if that customer hadn't walked in? Tacy asked, echoing Rochelle's thoughts. I honestly don't know, but it's not something I've had to worry about since, because he's been watching. Rochelle pointed out the window, to where the artist was setting up his stall in front of the stationery shop across the road. The customer who walked in has a stall on the footpath most nights, drawing portraits of people. He said if I ever have any trouble or need his help, just wave and he'll come right over. Do you know him? Rochelle hesitated. A little. He lives nearby. The night Jacob, he was there that night. He tried to help, and Jacob got angry at him instead of me. Tacy nodded slowly. So because of him you weren't injured worse? Rochelle wanted to nod, but she'd been unconscious. She still didn't know what had happened between getting knocked out and waking up in hospital, but the police had been there, and they'd advised her to get a restraining order, so... Tacy seemed to be able to read the answer from her expression, even without words. She dusted her hands on her apron. Well, I guess I'd better go out there and talk to him. Without another word, she marched out the door and across the road before Rochelle could stop her. Of course, then some customers came in, so Rochelle couldn't even watch the exchange, as she had to concentrate on getting their coffee order right without burning herself. When they finally left, and Rochelle had a chance to glance out the window again, both Tacy and the artist had gone. She sighed in frustration. You got a sec, Rochelle? She blinked. Tacy was sitting at a table in the corner with... Rochelle, I'd like to introduce you to Ben Stone. As of next week, he's going to be our artist in residence in the evenings, and this table will be reserved for him and his clients. Give him staff rates for anything he wants, same as the rest of us. Tacy hitched her bag higher on her shoulder. See you tomorrow. And she left. Leaving Ben Stone standing there with a big grin on his face, and his hand out for her to shake. Rochelle mentally shook herself for spacing out. She couldn't be mesmerized by his smile. It's not like this was their first meeting. She knew he was Scottish and he'd never talked to cows or sheep. And he could draw the most beautiful pictures. She took his hand. Warm and firm beneath her fingers, yet he didn't try to crush her hand like some guys did. He held her like he was afraid he'd hurt her. Ben Stone, he said. Of course, with a smile. Rochelle Burke, she replied. I never did get to thank you properly for what you did the other night, or for the picture." His grin only widened. "Did you like it?" She swallowed. "Did you have to make them look like penises?" "I mean, you made me look good, but I imagine if they'd really looked like dicks, I wouldn't have been able to look so serene, handing 2 cups of coffee to 2 giant walking penises." He sighed. "So you didn't like it? Then I shall endeavor to draw a portrait of you that you do like, on my first night as an artist in residence next week." Rochelle felt her cheeks redden. "I didn't say that." Actually, she'd pinned the picture up on the wall upstairs until she'd worried that Tacy's young daughter Rory might see it, and then she'd reluctantly taken it down. Well, I can't exactly put it on the wall or show it to anyone, can I?" Ben laughed. "No, I imagine not. My promise still stands. I shall draw you a new portrait, one suitable to hang on the wall and show everyone. In color, not just a quick pencil sketch. In between my real task, which is to be your protector." That last line touched a deep chord in her, a sort of unknown harmony she couldn't explain. It felt right while at the same time. "You don't have to do that. Honestly, I think all Tacy wants you to do is be a presence in the cafe, not to actually, well, not like that night Jakob tried to fight you. That's just... I think I owe you an apology for that night. If I had not walked you home, he would not have challenged me to a fight, and you would not have been injured." Ben bowed his head. "So any injuries you suffered that night were my fault?" Rochelle stared at him. "You mean, you hit me and not Jakob?" And now she was alone with him. Oh God, she had to get him out of here. Or she had to get out of here. "Of course not. I would never hurt a woman. His blow was aimed at me, but then he panicked and hit you instead. The hand that struck you was not mine, but I am still to blame." Rochelle relaxed. "Okay. He could stay then. No, don't apologize for him. He blames other people enough as it is. It was the last straw, and I'm better off without him. In fact, I'd like to forget he ever existed." Ben bowed his head. "On this we agree. It shall be as you wish. I shall never mention his name again." And she believed him. 28. Of course, the next morning threw a spanner into the works, right in the middle of her email inbox. Fremantle Prison was starting to do tours again, and they wanted her to resume her role as one of the night tour guides. So much for spending every evening with Ben at the cafe. Rochelle considered saying no, that the cafe was now giving her enough hours for her to give up her second job, but she liked doing the tours. For a couple of nights a week, she'd dress up in costume and pretend to be one of the prisoners, jumping out at visitors and telling her sorry tale. Martha Rendell couldn't tell her own story, so someone else had to do it for her. And while most of the tour guides had their facts straight and didn't sensationalize the tale, occasionally one of the actors on the night tour would make her out to be the evil stepmother, a villain who'd surely deserved her fate. No. She wanted her job at the prison more than she wanted to make coffee for Tacy. And she'd need both jobs when she got her house back, because she'd have bills to pay, and she'd be paying those by herself instead of splitting them with Jakob. Not that Jakob had ever remembered to pay his share of stuff. A quick chat with Tacy sorted things out. Keeping the cafe open in the evenings was definitely profitable, so Tacy would call in one of the casual staff to cover any evening shifts Rochelle or Octavia couldn't work. Rochelle could work her shifts at the prison and at the cafe, no worries. Except, that was 2 nights she wouldn't see Ben. Rochelle nearly laughed at herself. She barely knew the guy, and now she was pining for him when they were apart. Since when had she turned into a clingy teenager again? She'd see the man 5 nights a week, which was more often than she saw most people. Even Jakob hadn't come over on weekends when she'd lived with Gran, because he'd had family things to do on the weekend. Ugh. Enough about Jakob. She was trying to forget he existed, at least until the court hearing, which couldn't come soon enough. 29. The first few nights Ben came in, she barely got to speak to him. She was kept so busy serving customers she didn't get to leave the counter, and while her eyes kept darting to the corner where he had his own steady stream of clients, he never came up to her, not even to order a coffee. Before she knew it, it was closing time, and when she crossed the cafe to turn the sign to say so, he'd uttered, "Good night, Miss Burke," and departed. Every night it was the same, until she was so frustrated she wanted to scream. Just 5 minutes. If she could speak to him for just 5 minutes. Almost as if he was taunting her, he left a new picture of her on the table every night. She checked them over, making sure he hadn't included any dicks or other not safe for work bits, before adding them to the growing gallery on the cafe wall, beside the sign that said he took commissions. In the absence of commissions, he'd taken to drawing the cafe staff and patrons. He'd already captured likenesses of most of the cafe regulars, in a combination of pencil sketch and watercolors. Rochelle's favorite was one of a kid who came in with her dad for a hot chocolate once a week, a treat Rochelle believed was a bribe for attending some sort of appointment the girl didn't enjoy. Tacy usually gave the girl a froth kitten or puppy in her cup, but Tacy had gone home, so Rochelle had been forced to try her hand at froth animals. The result came out more like a teddy bear than anything she'd seen Tacy create, but the girl's eyes had lit up when she saw it, and Rochelle had felt a momentary warm glow inside that she'd succeeded. Ben had captured the light in the girl's eyes as she stared at the bear, the moment so real Rochelle wanted to reach out and touch it, even though it was really just a piece of paper stuck to the wall. She wanted to draw people in with her films to make them feel, but Ben did that effortlessly with a stroke of his pencil and a flick of his brush. She was dying to ask him how he did it. How he breathed such life into a simple piece of paper, and whether he could teach her to do the same. But she couldn't ask him if she never got the chance to speak to him. Shaking her head, Rochelle stacked the chairs on his table and began sweeping the floor. When she knelt down to scoop up the day's mess in her dustpan, she caught a glimpse of movement on the building across the road. She pressed her face to the window, peering out into the darkness. Or where the darkness seemed to grow darker as it started to dance. She abandoned the dustpan and dashed upstairs, her phone in her hand before she could remember pulling it out of her pocket. From the upstairs window, she had a much better view. The dark shadow she'd seen from below was clearer up here, and she thumbed the record button on her phone so she didn't miss a moment of the performance, for that was definitely the word for it. The Mothman had returned, and he had some serious moves. Only this time, he wasn't on the footpath, but on the rooftop across the road. She wished she could hear the music he was dancing to, but she'd have to open the window for that, and then he'd surely spot her and stop. So she watched, transfixed, her eyes darting from her phone to the scene before her, not quite believing her own eyes. Because even with Tacy's offer of a month's worth of free coffee, no one had managed to capture a second picture of the Mothman. Like he'd been hiding until now, and he only came out when she could see him. Or maybe he came out every night, but she'd usually gone to bed, so she didn't see him, more like. Because he might be shaking that peach-shaped butt just for her, or maybe this was all for someone sitting on the roof where she couldn't see. She knew there were apartments across the road. One of the women who lived there had a thing for Tacy's muffins, and she bought more muffins than coffee. Rochelle had scribbled her name on a coffee cup a few days ago though. What was it? Something starting with A. Analyze? No, it had reminded Rochelle of snorkeling and the sea. Anemone, that was it. Next time she saw her, she should ask Anemone if she'd seen the Mothman. Maybe even mention the free coffee, to see if she got a response from the woman. Because if she had a man who could dance like that, costumed or not, Rochelle would want to keep him a secret too. Oh God, he'd seen her. The man with the wings winked at her, then turned around and shook his butt at her before jumping down out of sight. Rochelle whirled around, putting her back to the wall beside the window, and stopped the recording with a swipe of her shaking finger. She half expected him to fly over here like Batman and demand her phone and the footage. Then she laughed at herself for believing the man in the suit could actually fly. Oh, his wings had looked real enough, but they wouldn't support his weight. They were a costume, not part of him. She focused on her phone screen and played back the video. Yeah, it was dark, but there was light enough to see the dude dancing on the roof. If she used some of Octavia's video editing software, she might be able to clean it up enough to upload it, and have a second viral video bringing droves to the cafe. A project for the weekend then, she decided, as she stuck her phone on the charger. After she'd finished cleaning and closing up the cafe for the night. It wasn't until she was lying in bed that night that she wondered what Ben would have made of it, watching that dancing winged man across the way. How would he have drawn him? Ben probably would have captured the wink and the butt wiggle the moment she'd known he was staring right at her. That moment when her heart had stopped, then beat double time as she'd been torn between panic and the need to watch whatever was going on. Wanting to run away, yet also wanting to step closer. Yep, she'd definitely been bitten by the crazy camera woman bug. The one that made her want to capture a moment, instead of running away like a sensible person. Rochelle sighed. She'd done sensible. Maybe it was time for a little more crazy in her life. 30. A girl Ben didn't recognize stood behind the cafe counter. "Where's Rochelle?" he asked, dropping his satchel on his usual table. "She's not working tonight," the girl said primly. Tacy breezed out of the kitchen carrying a steaming tray of clean cups, fresh out of the dishwasher. "Oh, hi Ben. This is Crystal. She'll be covering Rochelle's shifts while she's at the prison." Ben's heart stopped. "Why is Rochelle in prison?" Tacy laughed. "She works as a tour guide at the prison. Dressing up in costume and pretending to be one of the prisoners for tourists. There aren't any real inmates anymore, the place is for tourists now." Oh. Ben felt like a fool. Then again, how could he possibly have imagined the prison he and his brothers had escaped, before it could sap the life from them, was a place people chose to visit for fun? The future was a very strange place. She might be back before the cafe closes. She said she wasn't sure how late the tours would go, seeing as they'd only just started up again. Ben nodded. He could wait. The hours passed quickly as word had evidently spread, and a gaggle of girls all wanted their portraits drawn before they went dancing. Before Ben knew it, Crystal was flipping the sign on the door to closed. Ben threw his things back into his bag. "Good night," he called over his shoulder as he hurried out the door. It was a short walk to the prison, but he made the trip shorter still by climbing onto the roof and flying there instead. He dropped down in the shadows of the outer wall, then made his way to the gatehouse. It was strange to see the gates wide open and brightly lit with electric lighting. Despite the white limestone walls, he'd remembered this as a dark place. Not the sort of place Rochelle belonged at all. Nor the kind of place where there should be a gift shop, yet that's where he headed, for the sign said to ask there about tours. The woman behind the counter was busy selling miniature manacles and whips to a group of middle-aged women, who giggled as they pretended to flog each other. These women had likely never been forced to stand witness to the real thing, watching the blood splatter as grown men groaned and cried in agony. Ben shook his head. Best not to think about the time they'd whipped Torsten within these very walls, for daring to tell the truth about how shoddy the work on the walls was. If Torsten could only see that the walls still stood, he would shake his head in wonder. But Torsten would never see these walls or anything else again. He died trying to escape them, and in the end he had. He was resting in peace now, had been for more than a century, and his blood had surely been washed away while Ben slept. "Can I help you?" Ben stepped up to the counter, summoning a smile. "Hi, I was wondering if Rochelle's finished yet." We were expecting her home earlier. I'll check, the woman said, picking up what looked like a chunky phone that emitted a hissing noise. 9:15 tour group, have you made it to New Division yet? Garbled words came out of the device too quickly for Ben to comprehend, but the woman just nodded sagely, said, "Thank you, over," and put the phone down. Then she turned back to Ben. "She'll probably be another half hour at least. If it weren't so late, I'd say go get a coffee from the cafe outside while you wait. Maybe just take a seat at one of the tables instead. I can sell you a book to read about the history of the prison if you like, but if you're a friend of Rochelle's, you probably know all about the history of this place, and the prisoners who lived here." Ben forced himself to return her smile. "Yes, I do." It came out bleaker than he intended, but she didn't seem to notice. Or perhaps she mistook his tone for something more light-hearted. "I'll tell her you're waiting when she's done," the woman said, dismissing Ben with her eyes as she turned to help another customer purchase a doll in arrow-patterned pajamas that looked nothing like the convict clothing Ben and his brothers had worn. Shaking his head at the insanity of it all, Ben found the closed coffee shop and ensconced himself at one of the outside tables with his sketchbook. 31. Rochelle liked acting, but she definitely didn't like doing it in Victorian women's clothes. Some parts of the past definitely belonged in the past, she told herself as she shucked off the swishy skirts and eased back into her jeans. But it was worth it if it made the couple hundred people who'd toured the prison tonight question what they'd heard about the prison's inmates, and whether they were as guilty as they'd been painted. Maybe if enough people believed in her innocence, Martha Rendell's ghost might finally be laid to rest. "What a turnout," Karen said as Rochelle walked out of the costume cupboard. "We had to put on 4 extra tours and push some of them into next week. How did it go out there?" Rochelle smiled. "Very busy, and I admit I'm a bit rusty, but after the first few I got my timing right so I could pop out and spook them. I think I got my first scream on the 7:30 tour, or maybe it was the 7:15. It's good to be back. See you on Wednesday if you're working then." She waved and headed out. "Oh, your friend's waiting for you outside the cafe. He said he was worried you hadn't come home yet." Rochelle froze. "Jacob. It had to be. Is there another way out I can use to avoid him? I've filed for a restraining order against my ex, but the courts are being slow, and I don't want to run into him." Karen clapped a hand to her mouth. "Oh, I'm so sorry. He was so nice, I didn't think he could be anything but your friend. He's been sitting at one of the cafe tables, drawing for over an hour now." Rochelle dared to breathe again. Jacob could barely draw stick figures, and he hated any art that wasn't in-game. She risked a peek out the window and nearly laughed. Ben sat cross-legged on one of the benches, peering up at the gatehouse as the pencil in his hand seemed to move almost of its own accord across the page. "Shall I tell him to leave because we're closed?" Karen asked, wringing her hands. Rochelle shook her head. "That's my friend Ben, not my ex at all. He might draw a mean cartoon with that pencil of his, but he's no John Wick. Definitely harmless." She headed out into the courtyard to greet him. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Ben pointed at the gatehouse clock. "I've been drawing the owl. She's hunting the moths flocking to the light up there. Here, take a look." He held out his sketchbook. Sure enough, he'd drawn a dozen different vignettes of what appeared to be a small boobook owl, swooping out of the darkness to catch moths, before disappearing again. "Here it comes again," Ben said, pointing. Silent as the night breeze, the owl drifted over the gatehouse. Suddenly the creature darted upward, its talons snatching a fat moth out of the air, before the owl vanished over the wall. "Wow," Rochelle breathed. "I've worked here so many nights, and that's the first time I've ever seen an owl at the prison." Her shoulders slumped. "I should have gotten my phone out and filmed it." Ben shrugged. "We could wait and see if it comes back if you like." No, they're closing up. We have to go. But we could come back another night, or I could. He still hadn't answered her question. What are you doing here? He couldn't possibly have known there'd be an owl to sketch. That would be just too freaky. Another shrug. Tacy said you were working here this evening. When the cafe closed and you hadn't come back yet, I figured I'd come and see if you'd like some company for the walk home. So thoughtful. Jakob would never have thought about doing something like that. Rochelle tucked her arm through Ben's. I'd love some company. They weren't even halfway down Fairbairn Street before he asked, What sort of work do you do inside the prison? Well, if there was one job to explain badly. I pretend to be a convicted killer who was hanged over 100 years ago. Of course, Ben was shocked. He stared at her, and even in the ruddy glow of the streetlights, she could see the horror in his expression. For the tourists, she added, though this didn't seem to mollify him. Rochelle sighed. The nighttime tours of the prison are done by torchlight, and they hire actors to jump out at the tour groups and tell them part of the prison's history. Most of them pop out of prison cells in the main cell block or solitary, but they usually send me up to New Division because there isn't much space in the women's division for a tour group, and I dress up as Martha Rendell, a woman convicted and hanged for the murder of her stepchildren. It didn't come out until much later that she was probably wrongfully convicted, treating the children under doctor's orders that the doctors denied, but by then it was too late. She went to the gallows protesting her innocence, the only woman ever hanged at Fremantle Prison. Makes you wonder how many of the other convicts came here convicted of crimes they didn't commit, because someone else with more power rigged the trial to blame an innocent for their actions. Ben nodded gravely. More than we will ever know, I suspect. He seemed to relax at this, content to keep walking. Have you ever been on one of the tours? Rochelle asked. Played tourist inside a prison? No, Ben said. From the way he said it, Rochelle suspected there was more he could have said, but he was deliberately holding his tongue. If she didn't know better, she'd think he'd been one of the prisoners here, but that wasn't possible. The prison had been closed for almost 30 years since before she was born, and he didn't look any older than she did. Perhaps he'd been arrested for being drunk, or having a car accident. Or maybe he'd done something as a teenager and ended up in the juvenile justice system. Back in Scotland, maybe. I'll be working again Wednesday night. I could give you a tour if you like. I'll leave a ticket for you at the gift shop. When Ben looked like refusing, she hastened to add, we get all sorts on the tours. Sometimes even past prisoners and guards, who know all sorts of stories that even the tour guides haven't heard before. The stories this place could tell. She shivered. I'm not sure whether to be amused or insulted that you think I could have been a prisoner here, Ben said. Do I look like a criminal to you? And in that moment she knew he'd done time, but if she said anything he'd probably deny it. No you don't, she said frankly. But just because someone looks trustworthy or downright dodgy, doesn't mean they are. You tell me, am I making a mistake walking home with you? He grinned. I swear on my life that you are safe with me. Anyone who approaches us with the intention of making you feel unsafe, well, let's just say they might find themselves in danger or at least discomfort. She believed him. Which probably meant whatever crime he'd done as a teenager, it might have involved assault. But the sort where the victim might arguably have deserved it. Good, she found herself saying. As long as you don't get arrested. Then who would walk me home? 32. No matter how persuasive Rochelle tried to be, there was no way Ben intended to set foot inside that prison again. But as she grew increasingly suspicious at his refusals, rather than let her guess the truth, he was forced to say he would show up for a tour. He could make his excuses when he arrived too late and missed the tour next week, but for now, she'd seemed satisfied. He saw her safely home to the apartment above the cafe, then headed to a nearby rooftop to make his way to the arts center at the old asylum, as the life drawing class was being held there tomorrow. He might not be able to come out in sunlight, but he'd found a suitable spot in the ceiling above the room where the class was to be held, so that he could still join the class. Ben took his time exploring the old building, losing track of time so that by the time he returned to the classroom, the class was already underway. He didn't hesitate. He laid his sketchbook on one of the wide rafters, took a peek through the ceiling panel and began to draw. A figure took shape at the point of his pencil, a woman reclining on a dais, head pillowed on her arm as though she was sleeping. But the more he drew, the more familiar it looked. He'd seen this scene before. The way her arm stretched out, reaching for help she would never receive. Oh God, it was Pamela. The pencil shattered in his hand, now a million splinters that he deserved to feel stab into him, but they could not pierce his living stone skin. Because the lady who reached across 170 years for help, for justice, for vengeance, he had failed to give her any of them. Instead, he was drawing some other woman, drawn up in the same pose in which he'd carved Pamela, when he should be out there, hunting the man who'd killed his brothers or the man who'd murdered her. Not that he could leave the building yet, the sun still shone outside, though from the way it angled through the windows, in only a few hours he would be free. He had time to waste on this picture then, to pretend he was just another artist, instead of a vessel of vengeance. His gaze swept the class. The stationery shop assistant had said there would be a variation of skill levels in this class, and she hadn't been wrong. One man could barely manage to keep his lines straight, for the box beneath the model. Others had drawn figures that looked vaguely human, and then there was one woman who'd drawn a man, not a woman, pointing at her with an accusing look on his face. Ben blinked. There was another man on the page, and another. One had drawn a child, sex undetermined. There were women too, but not one looked like Pamela. Yet when he looked at the model, it was her face he saw, a likeness so remarkable. He turned to another page, and began again. Then again. Each time he began anew, the picture was the same. It was the statue of Pamela he'd carved into stone, then placed inside the folly he and Torsten had built for her father. It couldn't be her. It couldn't be. We'd like to thank you for being our model for this class. Everyone, please show your thanks with a round of applause. Ben glanced at the class. Everyone was putting their things away, as the model donned a sort of robe, and headed toward a smaller room off the classroom. Ben followed. He had to know. Perhaps she just looked like Pamela. A distant relative, a coincidence. There had to be some logical explanation that didn't involve Pamela coming back from the dead. He'd been convicted of her murder. Wished every day since that night that he'd been able to save her. If she was alive. Ben stepped out of the wall, right into the room where the woman had now covered her nakedness with modern clothes. She turned around and... He smiled at Ben. The hidden one emerges. Did you fancy your drawing so much you thought you would ask me on a date? A man. Ben was face to face with a man who looked nothing like Pamela, or any woman he'd ever known. This was sorcery of some kind. Like the kind that had killed his brothers and allowed him to live far too long. This man could help him. Ben thrust the sketchbook in front of the man's face. Explain this, he hissed. The man took the sketchbook, leafing through the pages with his perfectly manicured hand. Oh, this is truly lovely. You are quite talented. Ben would not be diverted by flattery. Explain how I drew this when I was looking at you. The man let out a sigh. People rarely go looking for the devil. Instead, they chase down their darkest desires and their deepest regrets, only to find they are unprepared when they come face to face with reality. He gestured down the length of his body. Her body. Ben found himself staring at a tall woman with Pamela's face, dressed in a modern black shirt and pants. He blinked and the man was back, his dark eyes smoldering. This man thought Ben was a molly. That he wanted him. Or that he lusted after Pamela. Ben shook his head. I'm not chasing any of those things. I want to set things right. Things that might still be fixed. He could not bring Pamela back to life, but if he could at least avenge her. The man let out a knowing laugh, as though he could read Ben's thoughts. If he was a sorcerer, perhaps he could. If it's redemption you're after, that's very much a human thing. You'll need to seek human help for that, as it's hardly the devil's speciality. He winked. After all, not even the devil has managed to redeem himself yet, and not for lack of trying. Wait, how had the talk turned to theology? Ben was no scholar and certainly not one of the clergy. The man reached into his pocket. I'll tell you what. If you decide redemption isn't your thing and you'd like something a little darker, with a side serving of vengeance, here's my card. He held out a shiny black rectangle between his finger and thumb. For a moment, his eyes seemed to be completely black, like he wasn't human either. Then Ben blinked, and the man looked normal again. Ben couldn't stop himself. He reached for the card. The next thing he knew, the man was sauntering out of the room, into the now empty classroom. Ben hurried to follow. May luck favor you and your new heiress, for young Pamela in your picture met her end long ago, and I'm sure has long forgotten about you and the life you know. If it truly is redemption you want, you must remember that redemption does not lie in the past, but only in the future. The man climbed into a black car as shiny as his calling card and drove away. Ben's breath caught in his throat. Not once had he told the strange man Pamela's name, nor what had happened to her. He pulled out the man's card. It read, Luce Iblis, CEO, Hale Corporation. Beneath that was a long string of sixes. A phone number, presumably. Of course, Ben would need to obtain a phone in order to call it, but he could do it. Devils and darkness, vengeance and... No. Ben tucked the card away. Maybe he'd look up this Luce Iblis with his talk of devils later, but he hadn't lied about wanting redemption. More than anything, he wished he could make things right. Justice more than vengeance. But redemption was a human thing, Luce had said. Almost as if he knew Ben wasn't human. Or that monsters were beyond redemption, much like devils. Like called to like, though he was fairly sure Luce wasn't quite the same as Ben. The otherworldly aura of darkness that clung to him was something Ben definitely did not share. But Rochelle was human, and he'd spent almost every night in this time trying to help her. Perhaps if he were to ask for her help, she might. She knew about history from a century ago. A woman wrongfully convicted of murder, 100 years dead. If she could find one woman in the mists of the past, perhaps she could find 3 men. His brothers and the man who'd killed them. If he found them, maybe redemption was possible after all. But if he wanted her help, he'd have to keep his promise, and turn up for that tour of the prison. Fine. If that was what fate demanded, then he would do it. He would walk willingly into the prison he and his brothers had built and escaped from, and he would laugh and smile like any of the other tourists. It wasn't like any prison could hold him now. Especially not one made of stone. And the devil, or whoever the mysterious Luce Iblis really was, he could wait. Because Ben had work to do. 33. Instead of going to the cafe when the sun set, Ben headed for the prison. The last daytime tour, one about the prison's convict past, was about to start, so he bought a ticket and joined it. The tour guide, a silver-haired man whose name badge proclaimed he was called James, led the small group onto the parade ground, now covered in black bitumen like the road outside. Imagine it's 1850. The colony is 20 years old, with only a few thousand Europeans, all free settlers, and they wanted cheap labor. But no one wanted to come to Western Australia, and those who did couldn't afford it, so they wrote a letter to the British government, asking them to send convicts. A letter that resulted in them sending Dunstan's ship to Fremantle with a boatload of convicts. Ben, Tor and Dunstan would have been aboard as free settlers, and maybe Pamela too if she'd lived. They built this place using limestone quarried on site right here. Back-breaking work it had been, especially with the useless tools that had been sent over with them. Torsten had spent days in the blacksmith's shop, insisting the poor apprentice smith forge everything anew until he had what he needed. Or this prison might never have been built. They'd assemble out here on the parade ground every morning to join a chain gang work crew. Ben shuddered. Chains had only been used for punishment detail when he'd been on those work crews. To have to wear chains every day, and he'd thought confinement to those tiny lonely cells had been the worst they'd face. Then the tour guide took them inside the main cell block, and pointed to the buckets. The toilet buckets. What in heaven's name had happened to the plumbing? They'd put sinks in every cell, carving pipes out of wood when there wasn't enough metal. Ben hadn't gotten hands full of splinters, only for the prison administration to change their mind and start using buckets. No wonder there'd been riots like the ones the tour guide talked about. If Ben had been one of the inmates then, he might have led the riot himself. Thank the Lord and fate, and maybe even that bloody butcher, for giving them the idea to escape. As it was, he'd never been so happy to see that gatehouse in his life. He wanted to hurry out the gates and never look back. Except, then you came. Rochelle stood in the courtyard, a beaming smile on her face at the sight of him. A smile he wanted to return, even in this pit of despair. You didn't seem all that interested last week, so I haven't arranged for a ticket for you yet, but I'll do it now. I've got to go and get changed, but I'll see you inside, yeah? Ben found himself nodding. Once more unto the breach. Actually, the second tour was more bearable than the first. Perhaps it was because the tour guides talked about prisoners in later eras, during the time Ben had slept beneath the surface. Or perhaps it was the costumed actors, appearing most unexpectedly along the tour, to tell a dramatic tale of a moment in the prison's history, before disappearing once more. He sensed Rochelle before he saw her, wandering the upper level before she surprised them on the stairs. She was dressed more like a woman of his time than the present day, and as she introduced herself as Martha Rendell, a mother with a most pitiful story, Ben began to understand why. When Rochelle clasped her hands together and cast her eyes heavenward, he almost believed she really could be Martha's ghost, and that every word she uttered was the truth as she said, I am innocent before God and man of having done anything that injured the children. Yet they'd convicted the poor woman, and hanged her for the murder of the children even as she proclaimed her innocence. Not the first innocent sent here to die, and not the last either. Applause from the other tourists jolted him out of his melancholy ruminations, but Rochelle had already made her exit, and he did not see her again. The tour ended where it had begun, in the well-lit courtyard where he'd sat sketching the hunting owl last week. The owl was hunting elsewhere tonight, or perhaps the creature had not yet awoken and would not break its fast until later. Ben settled down to wait. He found himself watching the people instead, reliving their tours in animated tones with accompanying hand gestures as they strolled out the gates, not realizing how lucky they were to be able to do so. Excuse me, sir, but we're closing. You'll have to leave. Ben glanced up. One of the tour guides was definitely talking to him. The woman locking up the gift shop flapped her hand at him. No, it's fine. He's waiting for Rochelle. You can stay until she comes out. She won't be long. Ben rose. I don't mind. I can wait outside the gate just as easily as here, as long as you tell her where I am. The tour guide and the shopwoman fell into a vociferous whispered exchange over whether he should stay or go. Before they were anywhere near a decision, Rochelle made one for them. Hiya. What did you think? I almost believed you were her ghost, Ben admitted. But I still can't believe how many tourists come to this place for entertainment. Rochelle smacked his arm. They come here to learn history in an entertaining way. It's not the same thing. Ben bowed his head in acquiescence. I'm sure you know far more about it than I do. Only about the women's prison, and the one archaeological field school I did back in first year, when I was trying for a double degree. Now I'd just settle for one if I can even manage that. I couldn't do the convict tour James said he took you on earlier. If anyone asks me questions about the prison's early history, I just point them at the convict database and wish them luck. A convict database? The words were familiar, but Ben had no idea what they meant all strung together like that. Sure. If it were still open, I'd take you into the convict depot, where they have displays of the original convict clothing and things, along with computers you can use to access the convict database. It's mostly used by people who think they might have convict ancestry. He'd given her the perfect opening for a story that might actually sound plausible, without telling her the whole truth. I had relatives who were convicts here, I think. Dunstan and Torsten Stone. Can you find them in your database? Sure. Rochelle pulled out her phone, tapped at it for a moment, then frowned at the screen. Okay, this might be better on my computer at home. When we get back to the cafe, you can come up and I'll search it for you if you like. How could he refuse? 34. Rochelle was conscious of Ben's gaze on her as she waited for Octavia's computer to start up. She'd considered using her laptop, but Octavia had the most massive monitors hooked up to hers, so it would be easier to see. The convict database chugged through its search, before finally the results flashed up. There were 3 stones, not 2, Rochelle said, scanning the screen. They all arrived in Fremantle on the 1st of August, 1852, aboard the William Jardine. Torsten, Dunstan and Ebenezer. Which ones did you say were your relatives? Ben looked thoughtful for a moment, then said slowly, all of them. They were 3 brothers. Rochelle shook her head. Makes you wonder what their parents were thinking, giving them such names. I mean, there are whole pages of men called William and Arthur and Robert and John, and then there's these 3. Can you imagine being called Ebenezer? Everyone would call you Scrooge. Ben coughed out a laugh. Actually, I think you'll find Ebenezer Stone was born before Mr. Dickens published his story, and in our family it was usually shortened to Ben. Rochelle sucked in a breath. She hadn't. Please don't let her have. Tell me I didn't just make fun of your name. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said anything. But Ben didn't look offended at all. He just stood there grinning. Ah, family traditions are hard to fathom, even when you're part of them. My mother was a great fan of Mr. Dickens, and she read A Christmas Carol aloud every Christmas until she died, and then it fell to me. Even the greatest villain can be redeemed, she'd say, when my older brothers would joke about me seeing ghosts at Christmas. I'm sorry for your loss. The words came out automatically, but that didn't make them any less heartfelt. Ben shrugged. She was sick and she was in pain. Death was a mercy to her when it came. Yes. Rochelle closed her eyes, willing herself to see her mother before cancer had gotten to her, and reduced her to the living corpse she'd looked like in her final days. She swallowed. She was supposed to be researching Ben's ancestors, not mourning her mother. She aimed the cursor at the first record. Let's check Ebenezer out first. She stared at the record. Somehow, she'd thought this Ebenezer must have been Ben's ancestor. But he couldn't have been, and the screen before her knew why. He died in June 1855. He was only 21. Ben nodded sagely, as if he already knew. Yes, but what happened to the other brothers? Right. Those were the ones he'd asked about, not his namesake. Ah. Right. Let's see. Dunstan's next on the list. An unmarried ship's carpenter, listed as literate, sentenced in Glasgow in 1850 for murder. Sentence for life, and that's all. Ben did not look happy. Search for Torsten, he urged. Rochelle clicked on the third brother. The only difference was his trade. Torsten had been a stonemason, not a carpenter. But still a murderer. Just like, yes, it said the same about Ebenezer. There's nothing else here, she said. I mean, for some of the others, you can see a death date, or a ticket of leave date, or the date they were pardoned. Ebenezer at least has a death date, but the others, there's nothing. Why not? Rochelle shrugged. Well, maybe the records got damaged or destroyed or lost. And not everything got recorded, thought it should have been. Or maybe they just disappeared, and nobody knows what happened. In the first few years when the prison was being constructed, the convicts slept in hammocks in a warehouse, where the Esplanade Hotel is now. There's a story that if they wanted to escape, all they had to do was sneak out the window and jump over the wall, and they could be free. Apparently the first place they went was to the pub, so all the guards had to do was wait until the pubs all closed, then go round them up again. Maybe these Stone brothers didn't go to the pub. Maybe they stowed away on a ship, or vanished into the bush, or... She couldn't think of anything else. Ben looked grim. Or someone killed them and no one ever found the bodies. She wanted to laugh, but he sounded too serious for it to be a joke. Is that, the story you heard from your family? Because colonial Fremantle had been a pretty backward place back then. Even Perth hadn't properly become a city until after the gold rushes started, and that was 40 or 50 years later. He gave a sharp nod. I heard the man's name was William Pearce. He owned a butcher shop on High Street. Rochelle shuddered. She had heard stories about murderers who sold bodies as meat to unsuspecting customers. What if this one had never been caught? She asked Ben to spell the man's name, then entered it all in the search box and hit enter. There were plenty of results, starting with some Fremantle history blogs and the State Heritage Register. She opened a few, then began to skim the articles. William Pearce arrived here in 1852 from Port Phillip Bay, that's Melbourne, and set up a butcher's shop on High Street. When his wife and children arrived to join him in 1855, he'd vanished. Just like the Stone brothers. His wife and eldest son managed the business for some time, before they sold the property to a shipping business, which demolished the old building and built a new warehouse and offices in 1907. They called it Central Chambers. Rochelle's mouth had gone dry. She swallowed, but it didn't seem to help. Where is that? Ben asked. Rochelle didn't want to answer. If she did, it would make it true. That 3 men had been murdered meters away from where she slept at night. But not saying anything wouldn't change the truth. She forced herself to walk to the window and point at the building across the street. The one with the gargoyle on top of the large letters that proclaimed it as Central Chambers. The building where the winged man had danced on the roof, not that many nights ago. Ben stared in the direction of her pointing finger. So close. All this time I was so close, he breathed. Then he seemed to recollect himself and bowed. Thank you, Rochelle. You've been most helpful. I must go now, but I will see you tomorrow night in the cafe. He raced down the steps 2 at a time. She trudged after him, knowing she'd have to lock the cafe doors behind him, but when she reached the doors, she saw they were already locked. And the back door was bolted shut. Yet he'd definitely left. Maybe he'd managed to deadlock the front door, and somehow pull it shut behind him. Yeah, that had to be it. As long as it was locked. His relatives might have been murdered across the street by a serial killer over a century ago, but she still didn't feel safe unless all the doors and windows were locked. If only the courts would hurry up and give her that restraining order, so she could get Jakob out of her house, where she didn't have to worry about horrible historical happenings. Ugh, what if there were still angry ghosts hanging around? 35. Standing on the street outside the house that had replaced the butcher's shop, Ben forced himself to breathe. This is where it had happened. Where his brothers had died. Where he'd breathed his last. Where the guards had found him and carted what they thought was his corpse up to the Skinner Street Cemetery all those years ago. The windows were all dark, but hadn't Rochelle said it was offices and warehouses now? The place would be deserted until daylight. And Pierce's family had sold it to someone else anyway. Wherever Pierce lived now, it wasn't here. He'd likely taken his ill-gotten gold and found somewhere else to hide it. What Ben needed was more information. Access to this line everyone's tablet and computer and phone seemed to be on, in whatever mystical way they managed it. For if Rochelle could find his brothers and Pierce on this line, then there surely were clues as to the butcher's current whereabouts too. He would start small, he decided, with a phone. Even school children possessed those, so surely the device would not confound him too much. In the end, it wasn't the phone itself but the purchasing part that confounded him. The shop assistant required identification along with Ben's money, and whatever identity papers Ben might have had when he first arrived in the colony were surely long gone. Even if they weren't, he doubted the man behind the counter would accept papers that said he was over 180 years old. So he was forced to steal one. Well, sort of steal one. He'd found a shop that was closed for the night and taken a phone from the cabinet, then left enough money in their cash drawer to cover the cost. Then he went up to an empty rooftop to open the box and do some research of his own. Only to discover that the phone screen was blank and would remain so until he had charged the battery, something which required electricity. Ben sighed. Back to school he went. 36. Is that your new boyfriend? Rochelle tugged the dress over her head so she could see who was speaking. Beth, one of the prison museum staff, and also possibly the most sunshiny person she'd ever met. Who? That young bloke who came in last week to do a tour with a ticket you'd arranged for him. She wished she had a boyfriend as caring or as talented as Ben. No, Ben's just a friend. He's the artist in residence at the cafe I work in, so he's kind of a colleague, if you could call Michelangelo's reincarnation a colleague, when the only thing you have in common is that you sometimes work in the same place. He's the kind of guy who'd sketch or paint the most beautiful models and actors in the world, as they fall hopelessly in love with him, and he'd have his pick of them if he only looked up from his work long enough to realize the look in their eyes is directed at him. Rochelle shook her head. He's so down to earth, and at the same time way out of my league. Don't sell yourself short, Beth chided. You know, when I was with Brad, I thought like that too for a long time, especially after he cheated on me, but it was never about me at all. It was about him trying to get into the pants of as many women as possible. What you need to do is something wild and crazy to build up your confidence a bit. Like pole dancing. I know this great dance studio that runs classes. Rochelle burst out laughing. I can't afford dance classes. I still haven't finished my degree, and I'm working this job and the one at the cafe just to pay the bills. Double the bills, seeing as I'm still paying all the bills for my house while my ex is still living there. You should do something about that. He should be paying his own way, especially if he's your ex. You don't owe him anything, Beth said, echoing Rochelle's thoughts. She'd get on that first thing tomorrow. Power and water weren't a huge issue, seeing as the solar panels kept the power bills down, and they didn't use much water in winter because the garden pretty much watered itself in the winter rain, and they were a nightmare to reconnect, but she'd be damned if she kept paying for his super-fast, unlimited capacity internet access when she wasn't using it. It wouldn't be enough to pay for dance classes, but maybe she could buy a new dress or something come spring. Well, there is something wild and crazy that actually brings in money you might want to try. Beth began, her eyes dancing. Don't even think about it. If I can't afford pole dancing classes, there's no way I could do it professionally. I'd only fall off my pole and everyone would laugh at me. She'd probably still do that in a class, come to think of it. Yet another reason why she shouldn't even attempt it. I meant life drawing classes. They run them up at the Fremantle Arts Centre, and they're always looking for new models. The only qualification you need is the ability to sit or lie still for extended periods, while people draw you. Rochelle's mouth dropped open. And by life drawing you mean? Beth nodded. Naked or mostly naked. In one of the classes they were aiming for a sort of classical style, like something out of ancient Rome, so they had me draped in a length of filmy cloth. It was probably one of the most empowering things I ever did, when Brad left me. All those people, devouring you with their eyes as they try to do justice to you with whatever medium they chose to work with. It's heady stuff. Makes you feel like an absolute goddess. In fact, I've heard some people find it addictive, wanting to model every week. They even offered me a mask to cover my face. When I looked at some of the pictures afterwards, especially that ancient Roman one, wow, just wow. They made me look amazing. Rochelle just shook her head. The thought of being naked in a room full of people and all of them staring at her, she couldn't imagine anything more embarrassing. I couldn't. Beth shooed away Rochelle's doubts with a wave of her hand. I think you'd be surprised what you could do. Ask your friend. If the man draws like Michelangelo, he's had plenty of practice drawing nudes, and unless he's got 100 eager apprentices willing to strip down like the Renaissance painters did, he'll have gotten it from life drawing classes. You might be nervous going in, but when you walk out of there, you'll feel like a goddess, I promise. Rochelle forced herself to smile when inside she was shuddering. Thanks for the tip. I'll think about it. After I'm done with tonight's tours. She plucked at the black dress she wore when pretending to be Martha Rendell. Because whether she was a murderer or not, I'm sure poor Martha was never a nude model for a bunch of artists. Beth shrugged. You never know. The newspapers at the time were full of reports about how immoral she was, for living with a man she wasn't married to, no matter how long he'd been separated from his wife. Maybe under those prim and proper clothes beat the heat of a woman who dared and bared all for those she loved. And they hanged her for it, protesting her innocence all the way to the gallows. Rochelle could only shake her head. Maybe Martha had wanted more out of life, but she'd never had the opportunity to reach for it, in between caring for her lover's kids and dying for them. I'll think about it, she said again as she hurried off to take her place along the tour route. 37. Good evening. 1 cinnamon roll and a double-shot espresso for my protector as promised, Rochelle announced as she set her tray down on the table. He told her several times he didn't need anything to eat or drink while he was working, but he had admired the smell of the cinnamon rolls when she'd extracted them from the oven, and she'd gotten him to admit he liked his coffee black. What are you working on? Today's masterpiece, he said, holding up the sketch. I do not stick my tongue out like that. God, she looked ridiculous. And just a bit like a lizard. Sure you do. Whenever you're doing a design in the froth on top of a cappuccino, you stick the tip of your tongue out, just like that. I'm going to add it to the collection. He pinned it to the wall, next to all the other sketches he'd done of her. Rochelle shook her head. If you and Tacy hadn't sworn you were here to be my protector at night, I'd wonder if you're a stalker. I mean, that many pictures of me is a bit much. Kind of like that obsessive guy in Amelie. Only the way Ben did it, it wasn't so much annoying as endearing. And he even showed up to see her safely home on the nights she worked at the prison. If she wasn't still sort of getting over Jacob, she might totally fall for the guy. He shrugged. When the cafe is quiet and it's just you and me here, I take my inspiration from you. I believe I shall call today's piece Blep. He scrawled the letters beneath the picture and underlined them. Until he went and did something like that. Rochelle had to laugh. You're a nutter all right, but they do say great art requires at least a little bit of crazy. Ooh, look, we have a customer. For you or for me? He pulled out his portfolio. For me, I think. I have a commission for him. Rochelle returned to the counter, though her fingers itched to get her hands on that portfolio. He kept his best work in there, along with all the stuff he didn't display on the cafe wall. His little gallery had definitely grown in the time he'd been their artist in residence, but she hadn't seen much of his other work since that first night she'd met him, sketching the sunset. She served a few customers, but her attention was on the exchange between Ben and the guy who was now gushing about how beautiful Ben's painting was. Then he turned it so Rochelle could see it, and her breath caught in her throat. In one hand, the guy held a photo of himself holding up a fish he'd evidently caught. Ben's painting, while obviously the same subject matter, brought it to life like it was a film and not a photograph. You could almost see the fish moving, its scales sparkling in the sun, like it was the bloody rainbow fish itself, but determination steeled the fisherman's eyes as he clutched his slippery prize, and you got the feeling if the fish made a desperate attempt to escape, the fisherman would probably dive right in after it. It was the final moment of a battle before victory was declared, but at this moment, it was still uncertain. Are you all right? She opened her eyes to find the customer had left, and she and Ben were alone in the shop again. I'm fine, she said. Just lost in a picture again. Why couldn't he draw her that beautifully? And calling it blep. What did you call that one? An audience with the Spangled Emperor, Ben replied. Because that's the sort of fish it was, and it managed to jump back in the water a moment after that was taken. The guy told me when he commissioned it, so that's what I painted. Not just the photo but the story behind it. Maybe that's why she could never capture emotion on film the way Ben layered it into his paintings. She could only take what was there. But Ben, he put part of himself into each painting, turning what you could see into something you could also feel. If she had the money, she'd commission him to paint her. Not her sticking her tongue out and doing mundane things like making coffee, but something more. A picture of her not as she was, but what she wanted to aspire to. Can I see what else you've been working on? She asked, her tone wistful. She didn't dare ask how much that portrait had cost. Of course. Ben set his portfolio on the table and opened it wide, beckoning her forward. The sunsets she remembered, though he hadn't done any new ones. The owl he'd sketched over the gatehouse had been turned into a painting, with the feathers on its belly reminding her of some of the mosaics she'd seen in medieval churches in Europe. She hadn't seen that kind of detail when the owl flew over, just the shadow of its wings before it was gone. He'd done some night landscapes of the port, all lit up to load and unload the ships, lights reflecting off the water so clearly it was like the opposite of a Van Gogh painting. And then there was, well, at first she'd thought it was another picture of the port, until she'd realized she was looking at trees and bushes all decked out in fairy lights. A garden seen from high above, with tables and chairs dotted about the lawn, all empty and lit only by 1,000 fairy lights. Where is this? She asked. She wouldn't have been surprised if he'd said it was pure fantasy. It's the garden at the Arts Center on the hill. The one that used to be an asylum. Viewed from one of the upstairs windows, she guessed, unless he'd sent a drone up with a camera to get a bird's eye view. It's beautiful. He ducked his head. You should see the real thing, though I don't think it's open to visitors at night, when they're closed. How did you manage to get in? I have attended some drawing classes there that finished after dark. And he'd gotten distracted by what he saw out the window and drawn that, instead of whatever they'd been set. Still life probably. A bowl of fruit or something. No wonder he'd drawn the garden instead. Have you ever done a life drawing class? God, where had that come from? She didn't even want to think about what Beth had said, yet here she was, blurting out rude questions. I have, most recently at the Arts Center. They've brought in a few different models over the last few weeks, and it's refreshing to be able to draw the human form in its most natural state once again. As if in answer to the next question she didn't trust herself to ask without being even more rude, he pulled out several sketches of a woman's back and shoulders as she reclined on a couch, facing away from him, and laid them on the table. You could see every muscle in her arm clearly outlined as it rested along the back of the chair, and only when you got to her hand did you see why. She was nervous, her fingers tightly clenched around the decorative molding. Rochelle would be nervous too, posing naked in front of all those people. She could barely believe Beth had been brave enough to do it. Have you ever had anyone offer to model for you? Oh God. She hadn't heard so many stupid things come out of her mouth since the last time she'd been drunk. Yes, back in Scotland. I lived in a small village, which didn't have life drawing classes the way Fremantle does now. So I was very lucky, otherwise all I'd have ever learned to draw was landscapes, and the occasional bird. Would you paint me?